Okay, I'm going to get started because there are as many people joining us online as there are in the room. But can I just say how wonderful it is to be meeting people in person for the first time, what feels like ages. Welcome to everybody, both in person and online, to this inaugural meeting of the Imperial College Cross-Faculty Mental Health Network of Excellence, as is our rather long title. We wish those who couldn't make it due to the Jewish New Year a Shana Tova. For those who don't know me, I'm Dasha Nichols, and I'm a clinical reader in child psychiatry in the Department of Brain Sciences and the network lead. Together with our fantastic steering group and the administrators, we've really looked forward to welcoming you both to this event and hopefully to joining the network. Our aim today is to showcase a snapshot of some of the mental health research that's already happening in the college, but also hopefully to stimulate you to think of what more could happen through a creative interdisciplinary collaboration. We postponed this event from its original date in July so that we could meet in person, so that we could converse, debate, put faces to names, and hopefully you'll all stay to enjoy a glass of wine later on in this glorious and privileged location. Thankfully, the weather was on our side as well today, possibly a little hot. I hope you will use the coffee breaks and the reception at the end to peruse I think we have 34 posters in total, so thank you to all who contributed, and to talk to those who are here present to present their work. There were also posters online and they'll be available to view after today, but we will, after the reception, towards the end of the reception, we'll announce the two winners of the £100 prizes for the best posters. Thank you to Louise Patterson for overseeing the poster process. So I'm going to start with a little sort of why we're here today. When I started work in psychiatry 30-something years ago, the asylums were in the process of closing and psychiatry units were being built on the back of general hospitals. Mental health was very rarely talked about outside the occasional and often misrepresented catastrophe in the news. Fast forward to 2021 and accelerated by the pandemic, mental health, I think, dominates our social discourse now, totally destigmatized and sometimes even celebrated. I doubt there's anyone here who doesn't have a personal experience or awareness of the impact of mental health problems. With that has come awareness of the scale and to some extent the nature of the problems, aided by science, of course, such as the global burden of disease studies, advances in genetics, neuroimaging, and so on. In 2015, mental health accounted for 23% of the burden of disease in the UK, and yet received only 11% of the health services budget and around 5% of research funding. Consequently, that's been a major focus for growth, thankfully, and you'll hear from Paul Matthews today a bit about the mental health research landscape as it's looking now. I've been talking so far about mental health in the singular, but of course mental health and its converse, mental illness, is as complex and multifaceted as physical illness. As a child psychiatrist who specialises in eating disorders, I feel no more competent to treat an adult with schizophrenia than a cardiovascular surgeon would to treat a patient with renal disease. So I'm hoping that one of the aims of this network will enable connections to people with the skills and the range of expertise to address the full complexity of mental health and mental illness, and the range of research approaches from the highly theoretical and public health to the highly pragmatic and clinical approaches. Today's meeting, we focused on Imperial staff and students, but future activities for the network could include linking researchers with experts with lived experience or with clinicians working with specific populations with specific mental health problems. We hope also to link with other networks across the college, such as the AI network, the HubX network, and so on, as well as use all our connections in the external world to bring you experts in with insights from a scientific perspective. We're looking for people to join our steering group, particularly from the natural sciences, business school and engineering faculties. We're quite faculty of medicine heavy at the moment, so if anyone is interested and has capacity to help, we will make you work. but please come and find me if you're interested in joining the steering group. You can find out more about the network, together with stories from some of us working across the field, and a message from our president, Alice Gast, and from Nick Jennings, of whom these cross-faculty networks were the brainchild, on our network webpage, which you can see behind me, which was conceived and developed by steering group members Lindsay Dewar and Pip Beattie, with help from experts by experience. So back to today. There'll be a mixture of online and in-person presentations. As I've said, you'll hear a little bit about the funding landscape, about the history of psychiatry at Imperial College, from researchers, including an early career researcher working across all of the faculties, and about opportunities for interdisciplinary research. And also from our guest speaker today, who sadly, her son's developed COVID and she's not going to be here in person, but she is joining us online, Professor Cathy Creswell from Oxford University, who is a professor of developmental psychology and also lead for the Emerging Minds Network. But we're going to start the afternoon, I don't know if he's ready yet, with some words from our provost, Professor Ian Walmsley, on behalf of the college.
Thank you, Dasha. I hope you can hear me. It's great to be part of the new world of hybrid meetings as a virtual participant. So good wishes to everybody for this experiment. I'm delighted to join you for the launch of the Imperial College Mental Health Research Network of Excellence. Of course, your network theme is important and timely. Following the pandemic, the importance of mental health is paramount, and the turmoil of the last 18 months has had a detrimental impact on the entire college community, as well as millions of people's well-being worldwide. Supporting mental health research, therefore, is essential not only for our community, but also for society as a whole, helping communities to build resilience, reduce stigma and discrimination. And it is an opportunity also for us, I think, to use our expertise and our connections as a college to help try things within our own community. So mental health is a strategic priority for the college, and this network therefore provides us that excellent opportunity to build on established and emerging multi-faculty collaborations in order to develop our mental health research. Further, it addresses very directly one of the four themes of our academic strategy, healthy society, as well as drawing in research from several faculties and supporting research-led educational programs that are a distinctive feature of Imperial's ethos. Multidisciplinary research, of course, is crucial to fostering innovation, tackling significant societal challenges, and is an integral part of the distinctive capabilities and way of working of the college. At Imperial, we recognize that the changes and the challenges we face require us to work together more effectively. We often, as in this case, have expertise and skills dispersed widely across the college, and we need to have effective ways to join up and harness those capabilities in order to enable us to tackle the more ambitious objectives that will make a real difference through research. This network, as Ash has noted, is the latest in a framework developed by Nick Jennings, the Vice Provost for Research and Enterprise, to facilitate working across departments, across faculties, and to help identify opportunities to grow in scale and depth as capability and funding are attracted to your work. Imperial College multi-faculty networks of excellence exist to establish and nurture connectivity in strategically important multidisciplinary areas, and they provide a significant competitive advantage to Imperial by uniting researchers around a common multidisciplinary theme, as well as enhancing the college's visibility in that area. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here at the launch of this latest network of excellence, and I look forward to hearing about all of the great things that the network achieves through both internal and external partnerships. And I know that all of those involved will play a large part in framing Imperial's contribution to this important area, so that we retain a position at the forefront of mental health research. Thank you and good luck.
Slightly ahead of schedule, but Paul, may we invite you to join us now at the podium. For those who don't know Professor Paul Matthews, he's the head of Department of Brain Sciences in the Faculty of Medicine and also the chair of the Neurosciences and Mental Health panel at the MRC.
Thanks, Dasha, and let me thank all of you who are both here and online. This is exactly what a college network should be. And I hope you can all work together to keep it alive and growing. This bringing together of disciplines around a big future challenge is at the core of what Imperial is, and certainly what the Department of Brain Sciences hopes to catalyze within the context of the college. So thank you, Dasha, thanks to all of your team, and thanks to everyone who's here. Now, I'm going to speak about funding. I will be very MRC-centric, but I'll touch on two of the other major funders towards the end. And I think the first thing that I can say about funding is really an echo of what Dasha introduced the afternoon concerning with her opening remarks. And that was that the very idea that we would be talking about the funding of mental health research might not have been imagined 10 years ago, for sure. People understood the importance of understanding psychiatric illness, and there has long been a focus on psychiatric illness and on some of its aspects. This then began to gradually creep out from the usual context of illness to something else that was less well defined, with work such as the pioneering work of David Nutt and his colleagues in looking at addictions, where the borderland between what constituted an illness and what constituted a behavior in society became progressively blurred. Now, we seem as a society to be very focused on the manifestations of mental health in the broadest sense, of which illness is only an extreme version. Dasha introduced me to the concept of the tip of the iceberg when she first came to the college, and I think that's one of the analogies that sticks with me most. The illness is just the tiny tip of the iceberg. Health in our society constitutes the bulk. So what I'm going to speak about is funding within the MRC context. Let me see if I can make this work. There we are. I'll say a couple of words about the MRC first, which has now somewhat changed its identity. It is now the Medical Research Council as a unit within UKRI, rather than an independent organization as it was a few years ago. But what I want to really highlight is that of the priorities in the Medical Research Council, which are listed here, mental health figures very prominently, equal to precision medicine, multimorbidities, advanced therapies, antimicrobial resistance, global health and prevention. That shows you how important it now is considered in the portfolio. It's about improving an understanding of the biological basis and environmental risk factors as they operate at a population and individual level. And really importantly for the discussion, that for many aspects of the discussion today, the Medical Research Council is very much focusing on childhood and understanding childhood and adolescent disease and interventions, because that's where we see the root of poor mental health in later life lying. These figures are slightly older, but budgets take a while to catch up. The current budget, I'm sad to say, is about level. It is fortunately remaining level, but it is not growing yet. In 2018-19, the MRC had a budget of 700 million, which was divided in a number of parts. What I really want to call your attention to is the green, which were the researcher-led grants. Units, institutes, and training fell into the blue, purple, and bright red sectors. Let's talk about mental health research. In particular, investigator-led programs remain the leading direction of funding for the MRC, and mental health has become a core of this. The Neurosciences and Mental Health Board has a specific remit to fund not just neurosciences and the underpinning biology, but excellent novel research across the whole spectrum of mental health as well as neuroscience research. So the board funds cohort studies, researcher-led programs to understand, characterize, and try early interventions in mental health as well as in traditional psychiatric illness and neuroscience. In 2018, the MRC spent an estimated £48 million on mental health research in the context of grants and fellowships, and really the number for 1 year is not unimpressive. And this is in addition to the funding that it gives in other related areas, such as neuroscience of neuroinflammatory disorders and their secondary morbidities for mental health, cohorts, the imaging facilities that allow many of you to do your work, and so on. In 2017, the MRC launched its strategy for lifelong mental health research. Now, the importance of this is that the way the organization works is there's the leading edge of thinking represents, is described to the community for greater stakeholder involvement as a strategy. That strategy document is itself developed by members of the mental health community and others across the country, and it's used to set an agenda that is then rolled out serially, both as priorities for the boards to work on as people come with investigator-led grants, and as specific strategic initiatives. I'll refer to a couple of those in a minute. This document really highlighted what has turned out to be a really outstanding plan moving forward, focusing on children and young people, trying to develop ways of stratifying populations for precision medicine, harnessing big data in order to inform us about best patient, best treatment, developing new interventions, looking outwardly, at least until the ODA funding was restricted recently, addressing prevention, and of course, very important for all of you who are early career researchers, working to build capacity. And Anne Lingford Hughes has really been very critical to that plank of the MRC policy. Strategic activities have revolved around particularly the cross-council, MRC, AHRC, ESRC, adolescence and mental health, and developing mind strategy, and building a mental health research platform. Well, I don't need to tell all of you about adolescence. It's a complex time, and whether you're a parent, someone who's just managed to survive it or a professional working with it. I think we all recognize that. 50% of mental health problems begin by the age of 15, and 75% of mental health problems emerge somewhat later. The focus on young people is well placed. An adolescent mental health strategic fund was established as a strategic priority initiative within UKRI, and the MRC has been leading on this. This provides £35 million in focused funding over 5 years. It's currently being directed by Eamon McCrory after a national recruitment. And it's about developing a multidisciplinary program and portfolio to understand the developing adolescent mind, mental health and well-being. It's going to be delivered through what for the MRC is charting some new territory, a novel set of approaches, community building, as well as multidisciplinary research methods development and knowledge mobilization and transfer. The flagship research programs have already begun to be kicked off. This is a list. I won't go through the list, but 24 million is a significant kickoff against the 35 million investment. There's going to be, in addition, a mental health research platform, which the vision for which is to develop a coordinated and integrated data platform for mental health research for the nation, for the 4 nations, that will link longitudinal cohorts and multidimensional data with stratified medicine analytics and development capabilities. This call was led in partnership with Health Data Research. It's about improving the usability, quality, discoverability of mental health data, which currently is in lots of different places, trying to pull it together. And at the core of this is a program known as Data Mine, led by Anne John at Swansea and Rob Stewart. Now, this is another way that the MRC works is by trying to respond to current social priorities, sometimes very urgently. And this does 2 things. First, it reinforces the relevance of strong science for guiding policy in the country, something which one needs to continually remind our masters about. But the second thing is it provides a mechanism whereby funds, new funds from other sources can be directed towards key areas of science. And COVID-19 over the last year was one such example. The MRC mobilized itself very quickly. And with UKRI and NIHR developed joint calls for rapid response, with mental health research being funded. Many of you at Imperial, or many of the there were several proposals at Imperial that were successful in this competition, really delivering key information very, very quickly. There was a major investment in long COVID. Paul Elliott, who's leading REACT-2, this has been extended into a long COVID study that includes not just understanding the population epidemiology of this and the neuroscience, but also mental health aspects of long COVID at a very large national scale. This is a study that one is thinking, one is talking about 50,000 and more participants. It is a big mental health experiment. And then a variety of other COVID proposals have come through as standard board proposals. Now, as we go to the future, the Mental Health Board will be highlighting opportunities for funding, which are areas that we want to really prioritize and encourage new proposals for around children and adolescents, comorbidities of physical and mental health, an area that is of particular interest to me, stratification based on symptoms, behaviors linking to genetics, thinking about the complex diseases of psychiatry being fractionated into the genetic traits and their associated behaviors in society more broadly. There's going to be an additional call, and the next call for the Adolescents' Mental Health and Developing Mind strategic proposals on methodology in September. There currently is the scoping on the mental health research platform will continue to grow over the next year. So lots of real opportunities in addition to the standard opportunities. I think I'll skip over that, and actually let me just go back. I think I should say a word about this. There of course are two other major funders in the country, one very large. The Wellcome Trust remains a big player, and they have over the last year unveiled their strategy. It's not one that I'm intimately familiar with. It's been somewhat long in coming. So in addition to all of its standard schemes, which will be fully clarified later in this year or early the next, allowing fellows, research programs and partnerships to develop, they have put aside a major amount of funding for a 5-year, £200 million investment in understanding how to what the underlying mechanisms are, how to prevent and treat anxiety and depression in young people. What's really special about this call and differentiates it from the MRC's call is this is global in scope. It's not UK-centric. It's about finding the best solutions, the best problems anywhere in the world. It's done through commissioned calls that are responses to RFPs that will be rolling progressively over the 5-year period. At the core of it is also in parallel with the efforts nationally or supranationally within the 4 nations led by UKRI, there's a global mental health data bank effort, which is to discover at a global level what works for whom and why. And of course, I hope you all are familiar with the charity MQ, which was fostered initially by the Wellcome Trust, but is an independent charity that has really grown into a major player in mental health and psychiatric disease. Really an unusual entity, because before MQ, I really would find it hard to name a single large charity that took on psychiatric disease and mental health because of the stigmas that Dasha referred to. But MQ has an ongoing funding program that's international, again in scope, around major challenges for young people's health, same sorts of questions we've heard in the other contexts. Importantly, Fellows Awards, trying to identify the best and the brightest and give them a kickstart in their early career. Mental health data science, very familiar theme. They're taking a slightly different niche. We certainly hope that all of these are going to come together. And then the really important Psi Impact program, which is about trying to seize opportunities for interventions that can be identified now to develop and validate them. Imperial is really well placed to take advantage of this funding. New approaches are going to be needed if we will try to capture the phenotypes for mental health across the broad population and understand how to deliver supportive sorts of care at scale. This is where we, sitting in an engineering and natural sciences school as a faculty of medicine, really should be realizing advantages. And I hope this is where this network is going to help us go. So thank you all, and thank you, Dasha, for bringing us here.
Of work to do and hopefully new friends to make. Okay, I realise actually, Mike, we probably should have asked you to say something about NIHR and funding for mental health research as well. But maybe people can be aware that Professor Mike Crawford, if you don't know, has a long association with the NIHR, which is at the more clinical end of funding as well. And there's lots happening there around mental health too. Our next speaker, yes, is you, David. Is the esteemed and sometimes controversial Professor David Nutt, who's Professor of Psychiatry and Addictions Research here.
Dasha, you told me not to be controversial today. We'll keep that for dinner anyway. We'll keep that to the drinks, because I guess I'm asked to look at the history because I'm part of it now, almost receding rapidly into the distance. But I have been here 11 years, so I guess I've got some sort of residual skin in the game anyway. So I guess most of you probably didn't realise that there didn't used to be psychiatry at Imperial. In fact, there didn't used to be medicine in Imperial until about 20 years ago, when the medical schools in London were reorganised and moved out of the hospitals into universities. And Imperial was fortunate to pick up 3 rather distinguished medical schools, St Mary's, Charing Cross, and also the Hammersmith, which was the Royal Postgraduate Medical School. And those came together to form the Imperial College School of Medicine, of which psychiatry is one. But St Mary's and Charing Cross both had very strong traditions in psychiatry. They were very influential when I was a junior doctor, a junior psychiatrist. I worked at St Mary's and crossed swords with people like Stuart Montgomery and Peter Tyrer, and they were to some extent influential in my deciding to come into psychiatry. And at Charing Cross, we had Stephen Hirsch and Tom Barnes. Tom's not here, is he? Yeah, and what was interesting about those 2 separate medical schools was that St Mary's one focused largely on what we would call in those days neurotic disorders or personality disorders, and Charing Cross was strongly focused on schizophrenia. And before Charing Cross was fused with Imperial, Charing Cross was using the facilities of Imperial to try to explore biological mechanisms of disorders like psychosis. And some of you, I don't know if you can remember this, I don't suppose, but I think the very first plasmapheresis experiments in Britain were done at the Hammersmith, and of course they were done to help people who had suffered from a range of severe immunological disorders. But Stephen Hirsch had the vision of trying to see whether if you cleaned out the immune system of people with schizophrenia using plasmapheresis, whether you might actually improve their mental health. It didn't work, but it was an example of the ability of psychiatry to link with a cutting-edge medicine and see if you could therefore innovate and improve patient outcomes. And of course, psychiatry doesn't exist just within those hospitals. It also exists within mental health trusts. And we've had a very good working relationship between the 2 large trusts in West London, the Central and North West London Trust and the West London Trust. And our clinical services are provided by those. And many of us work for those as well as for the Imperial College. And what I've done on this one slide is try to pull together 3 decades of research and collaboration. So the blue blocks are topics or diagnoses or areas of psychiatry, and the green links are links to other departments, divisions, research groups within Imperial College, and also the other colours relate to links outside. And you've already heard Dasha mention NIHR, the large funding facility within the NHS that certainly people like Mike Crawford have been extremely effective at raising money through. But you can see that we've got a range of skill sets, a range of interests going from personality disorders and self-harmful behaviour with Peter Tyrer and Mike Crawford, through the child and adolescence group, which was at St Mary's, schizophrenia I've mentioned already. And then about, as I say, 11 years ago, Imperial added my group and Anne Lingford Hughes' group to the mix. to cover addiction and also neuropsychopharmacology, and the neuropsychopharmacology group has expanded to include psychedelics. But there's been an enormous amount of cross departmental activity already, and you can see in the middle there, primary care and public health has been one of our major collaborating systems. But we've also worked with hepatology, and I want to just emphasize one of the most innovative developments in terms of reducing the harms of alcohol has been done with the St Mary's group in accident and emergency, where they've developed rapid screening systems for people with alcohol problems presenting to A&E, and also follow-ups, which have proved quite influential in reducing the burden that essentially intoxicated people have presented to A&E, and that's something that's been rolled out in many other sites nationally. It's proved to be an extremely effective way of trying to reduce people's continually returning to A&E in a state of intoxication which causes harm, and not being appropriately educated as to how they might moderate or regulate their drinking. Of course, in the middle there, we have the cyclotron unit. One of the reasons I eventually came to Imperial all those years ago was because I've been commuting to the old MRC cyclotron unit from Bristol for about 10 years before then. And that's undergone a number of mutations. It's changed its name. It's now called Invicro, but it is still one of the great imaging centres in the world, using particularly one of the few that does positron emission tomography at a very cutting edge level. And then we've got the Data Sciences Centre in South Ken that has already started to link with some of our team, particularly Louise Patterson, in terms of looking at the image sets we've developed from our MRC funded addiction research, and also the Medical Research Council Clinical Sciences Centre, where there's also been quite a lot of crosstalk. And somewhere down in the right-hand corner, after Pekini Matthews, there's someone else. I think it's Thomas Knopfel. He's probably not here, but he's a basic scientist who does some very interesting genetic manipulations of rats. And so we've got access through him and through Magdalena Sastre to preclinical research. And it's good to see Bill Wisden here as well, also a world leader in terms of preclinical research on the GABA system. So there's great opportunities to dig deep into the basic science, as well as to go broader into other forms of research. So what have the teams here achieved over the last 30 or so years? Well, this is a series of bullet points which give you the outline of the schizophrenia research. One of the challenges in schizophrenia research has been to try to develop better treatments than the ones which were developed in the 1950s, like haloperidol, raclopride. Most of you think of raclopride as being a PET tracer, those of you who've ever heard of it. But in fact, it was developed as a possible very better tolerated neuroleptic. So that was one of the very first trials. The next trial is shown on the graph there, the clozapine study trial. And that was a landmark study because it was the first British study that really emphasized the unique property that clozapine has to treat people with schizophrenia where their illness has not responded previously to conventional medications like haloperidol or chlorpromazine. And subsequently, Tom Barnes and his team have done a huge amount of work. They have really led schizophrenia research in the UK, looking at new medications, looking at how you can use psychological add-ons like CBT. Also, they've invested in art therapy. And more recently, they've tried to deal with the persistent problem of negative symptoms, the residual symptoms of schizophrenia, which aren't amenable to treatment by dopamine receptor blockers, by using drugs such as citalopram, an antidepressant, which did give some measure of improvement, suggesting that at least some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia might be related to depression. And there's been a huge national impact. And Tom Barnes is, I think, generally seen as one of Britain's leading opinions and authorities in this field. And he's had a huge influence on a range of NICE, BAP, and other guidelines. And the other major theme is the one that now is headed up by Mike Crawford here, but also Peter Tyrer, who's now gone on to have a global status and a global role in terms of personality disorder, because he's managed to essentially rewrite the ICD-11, the WHO classification for personality disorders, in his own image, which is basically the model of personality disorders that he generated through his research here at Imperial. And that's a great commendation to him for persevering with what you might, most of us would see as a more rational and practical form of personality disorder classification. And also that they've been very effective in doing trials. They've conducted the UK's only long-term cohort study. They've done an evaluation of specialist services for people with personality disorder. And they've done a series of trials, CBT, nidotherapy, that is Peter Tyra's own particular terminology. It's a therapy of trying to make the world for people with personality disorders more amenable to them rather than trying to fit them into the world of ours, which isn't particularly helpful. Problem-solving therapy, therapeutic communities, and also lamotrigine. And that graph there shows you that's as negative a finding as you'll ever get. Lamotrigine isn't of great value. And Michael, I don't know, when is your clozapine study coming out?
This month.
Well, fingers crossed. Let's hope it's better than lamotrigine. But given that certainly drug treatments hasn't been very helpful in personality disorder, they've also moved on to look at other ways of helping people with these disorders through educational programs, video training, and DBT skills training. And one of the problems with rolling out interventions in personality disorder is that current interventions are long. They last 12 to 24 months. They're expensive. People don't necessarily see through the full course. So the group here have developed their first individual low-intensity intervention, structured psychological support proposal, and that has shown significant benefits, which I suppose will mean it will be hopefully adopted as a new way of helping people with personality disorders. And the potential of nidotherapy, social prescribing, and helping patients who've succeeded in dealing with their problems and bringing those into the mix for developing the next generation of therapies is undergoing evaluation at present. Moving on to addiction, we've been very fortunate that about 12 years ago the MRC decided to invest in addiction research, and that's led to something really quite interesting, which is a reframing of what was at that time the generally accepted sort of global theory that addiction was a dopamine disorder. And our group, particularly with Anne Lingford Hughes, were able to show that that's not true, that dopamine clearly has a major role in the action of some addictive substances, particularly amphetamines and also alcohol, but not opioids, not cannabis. And eventually, after years of battling with the I guess NIDA, the American organization that really pioneered the dopamine theory, we got this paper out in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, which shows that when you put it all together, it's really only, as I say, amphetamines and probably cocaine and crystal meth and alcohol that do release dopamine. The other drugs of abuse probably work on other systems. And what might those systems be? Well, one of the possibilities is that might be the endorphin system. And because we did have access to an opiate receptor sensitive PET tracer, carfentanil, down at the MRC unit, the in vitro Imanova unit, we were able to explore that in detail. And I'll show you a bit about that in the next slide. But on top of all that, we began to do what I think is the future of addiction research, which is to look at the systems biology of the brain in relation to addiction. And that involved pulling together a group from Imperial, Manchester and Cambridge in what was called the ICAM system, the Imperial, Cambridge and Manchester Initiative. And that was a big MRC funded initiative which set out to ask the question, can we identify processes, circuits, behaviors that are common to addictions and therefore begin to maybe focus on those rather than on the single individual neuroreceptors, neurotransmitter targets that up till then people had tended to focus on. And you can see in the bottom right here that the different targets we address were reward sensitivity, response inhibition, impulsivity, that is, and emotional regulation, because we believe that those are the three major vulnerability factors in relation to addiction. And this was a truly remarkable study. It was almost impossible, frankly, to think it could ever work, because it involved taking people with alcohol dependence or cocaine dependence or heroin dependence, detoxifying them, and then giving them 5 brain scans where we exposed them to the cues which provoked, or the methodologies which activated these systems in their brain, and then looked to see to what extent we could interfere with them with a range of different treatments, naltrexone, a dopamine D3 antagonist, and an NK1 antagonist. And it's certainly the most sophisticated and complicated imaging study ever done in addiction, certainly in terms of the pharmacology of addiction ever. It's produced a large number of publications so far, and it's led on to ongoing research by Anne and Louise Patterson, taking one of the more promising interventions, an NK1 antagonist, into heroin dependence. And it also led to fruitful collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry. The bottom left-hand side there, you see the action of the first ever drinking regulator, the drug narmorphine, which is licensed for the treatment of binge drinking. No one really knew how it worked, so we explored its impact on reward processing in alcoholics when they were drunk by giving them alcohol intravenously, putting them in a scanner, making them do the tasks, and we showed there very clearly that the blue blobs show areas of the brain where narmorphine attenuates reward processing under the influence of alcohol. And that's actually one of the very first studies ever to look at the effect of alcohol on brain imaging using alcohol as a probe. And it also shows quite clearly that narmorphine interacts with the reward processing system. And that probably explains why it helps people control their drinking, because alcohol becomes less rewarding. My own particular interest, and the reason one of the reasons I came to Imperial those years ago, was to take advantage of the power of PET to explore endogenous neurotransmitter release. At that point, we could only reliably measure dopamine release in living human brain using displacement by that original possible antipsychotic raclopride. Well, it turned out it was not much of an antipsychotic, but it was a very useful tracer for the dopamine system. But things have moved on, and now we have been able in the last 10 years to explore 3 new tracers to look at different neurotransmitters. There's the one on the left, RO4513, which is a alpha 5 selective subtype GABA tracer, a bit hard to explain. And that's a beautiful image of the distribution of those receptors, which you can see are largely in the limbic system in the medial prefrontal area. And we were able to show that if you increase brain GABA concentrations with the uptake blocker tiagabine, you could significantly reduce the tracer binding of this particular ligand. So you have essentially a measure of GABA receptor or GABA release or synaptic GABA elevations, which you can estimate based on the displacement of that trace, in the same way as displacement of raclopride can be used to estimate dopamine release. And that was the first study ever done that showed you could do this in humans. And what was particularly interesting is it showed that the MRS, the magnetic resonance spectroscopy signals of GABA, had no relevance whatsoever. They were independent of that. And a lot of people have made hypotheses based on MRS and GABA, which are clearly now rather irrelevant. In the middle, we spent a lot of time trying to work out how we could measure endorphin release, because as I'll show you in the next slide, we had a theory that at least some aspects of addiction were due to a deficiency of endorphin, natural endorphin function. And the one we eventually found worked was amphetamine. Now, that's not intuitive, but amphetamine, probably through dopamine release, causes endorphin release. And you can see at the top image there, those 2 images on the right-hand side, you can see there's reduced binding. The red blobs in the middle are less on the right-hand side. And that's the relative reduction in endorphin release as demonstrated by relative reduction in carfentanil binding in people who've been given amphetamine. So amphetamine releases endorphins. Endorphins compete at the receptor with carfentanil. And you can see from those 3 graphs underneath, you can see that there's significant reduction in the binding of carfentanil following amphetamine in 3 regions, the putamen, the thalamus, and the frontal cortex. And that was the first really viable approach to measuring endorphin release that's ever been. And I'll show you the results of that when we've moved it into patient populations in the next slide. And then finally, very recently, we've been trying to do the same with serotonin. One of the great goals of psychopharmacology in the last 50 years really has been to try to find out what the role of serotonin in brain function is. We know it's important. We know that drugs that work on the serotonin system have significant effects, particularly in anxiety and depression. There have been theories that depression is a serotonin deficiency disorder for a long time, but no one had managed to measure the release of serotonin in a living human brain. And a few years ago, this tracer became available, SYMB36. This is a 5-HT2A agonist tracer. It's a psychedelic drug. It works on only binds to the active site of the 2A receptor. And it was we were one of the few places in the world that had access to this. And again, we showed that amphetamine, which we knew from animal studies would release serotonin, will also reduce serotonin in humans. And you can see, if you could get rid of my image, can you get rid of me in the bottom corner, please? Is it possible? Thanks. You can see that that SYMB36 binding is attenuated following amphetamine challenge, suggesting that amphetamine releases serotonin, and serotonin displaces the SYMB binding. So this was a very satisfactory outcome of a decade's research. And we were able then to explore the theory that maybe some elements of addiction are due to individuals seeking to replenish what might be deficient in them, which might be that they don't have enough endorphins, that they're using drugs or using other activities like gambling somehow to restore or to elevate a internal deficiency state of endorphins. And on the left-hand side, you see the 2 graphs there show that both in gamblers and in people with alcohol dependence, there's reduced endorphin release using the carfentanil displacement approach. So basically going down is more endorphin release, and for both the gamblers and the right hand, in the blue bars, the alcoholics, they're significantly less endorphin release in both those 2 deficiencies. And we're now interested in the idea that maybe gamblers gamble because that does release endorphins, whereas potentially other cues or even drugs, as I say, like amphetamine, don't do that. And on the right-hand side, again, if you could get rid of my image, please. This is work from David Arizzo, submitted to Molecular Psychiatry, now showing that in people with major depressive disorder, there's reduced release of serotonin as estimated by this methodology. That's the left-hand box, and on the right-hand box, you can see that very interestingly, the depression scores predict or correlate quite strongly with the amount of serotonin release. So this would be really quite an important finding, because it suggests that people are depressed because they don't effectively release enough serotonin to keep them undepressed. So it'll be interesting to see what the referees make of that. It's the first demonstration in a living human brain of a deficiency of serotonin. It's been demonstrated in post-mortems before. We've also been working with the neurologists, collaborating on the development of this tracer. This is a tracer that Robin Tyack, who's in my group, was working on for a long time before he came even here to Imperial. It's a tracer that looks at, probably looks at some kind of variation in reactivity of astrocytes. We can't say for certain, but it is a probe for the imidazine receptor. The imidazine receptor is altered in diseases, animal models of Alzheimer's, it's altered in animal models of Huntington's and stuff. And here you see the first study. That's just published in molecular neuropharmacology, I think. Could you get rid of my picture, please? Molecular psychiatry, yeah. And this is from this collaboration of our group with Paul's group and the Dementia Research Institute, showing that there are significant changes in the uptake of this tracer in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And interestingly, it seems to relate to whether they're A beta positive or negative. We've also got papers with the Huntington's Research Group and the Parkinson's Research Group showing, again, similar alterations. So this tracer is now becoming used as alongside measures of amyloid and glucose uptake in studies of disorders of neurodegeneration. And then finally, the psychedelic group. So as some of you will know, we've been exploring the brain mechanisms of psychedelia. How do these drugs work? What is the psychedelic state? For about 15 years now. And on the left-hand side is a little diagram that shows that we've got a very good understanding now of the psychedelic state, going from activity at single cells in the layer 5 neurons of the pyramidal system through to alterations in brain entropy, dysregulation, a disruption of cortical synchronicity, producing a state of high entropy of the entropic brain. And that then leads to increased connectivity because areas of the brain, such as the default mode network, which typically regulate brain activity, are disrupted. So the brain becomes much more free to interact than it's normally allowed to. And that research set out really just to explore what the 5-HT2A receptor is doing in the living human brain and why psychedelics are psychedelic. It certainly showed that, but it then went on because we showed it perturbed two of the drivers for depression, the default mode network and the subgenual cingulate cortex. So we then went on to do trials in depression. In the top right-hand box, you see this remarkable effect. A single dose of psilocybin, a single trip, produces the most powerful improvement in resistant depression of any treatment ever. And that, in some people, it's lasted for years, and others, it slipped back. But this is a truly remarkable piece of translational science. The neuroimaging suggested it might work. The trial showed it did, and now it's gone into clinical trials in a number of countries. Psilocybin is now the very much the hot area of research in relation to depression. On the bottom shows the follow-up study we did when we did a head-to-head comparing psilocybin with the gold standard antidepressant, now SSRI antidepressant escitalopram, and showed that the psilocybin worked better and faster than escitalopram, confirming the results of that earlier open trial. And that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine just a few weeks ago. And we've also done a huge amount of public engagement. This is a topic that is peculiarly interesting to the general public, probably because they have vague memories of the 1960s and the music, etc. And we've made a couple of films on this, and one of which you may have seen. So that's the past. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing. Yes, we also did the first imaging study of MDMA. That also was quite fascinating because it showed a completely different profile activity to psychedelics. It showed very much a subcortical inhibition, dampening down areas of the brain like the amygdala and hippocampus. And that led on to a clinical trial that's just been published of MDMA therapy for alcoholism as well, and another TV. So that was the past. This is the future, and I'm delighted to have made some contribution to it starting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was awesome tour de force of our achievements at Imperial so far. There's more to come, I'm sure. And also for sort of linking mental health with brains. I think that's always quite a helpful way of thinking about it. It's got very hot in here, so hopefully we can open the doors during the tea break. We've got a break now for just over half an hour, so please feast your eyes on the posters that are up. If you haven't put your poster up yet, please do. Don't forget there's a prize, and have a cup of tea and come and talk to us. Those of you online, the posters are all online on Padlet. So you can get yourselves a cup of tea and peruse the posters yourselves. See you back at 3:35. Please find your way to your seats. Our next speaker is having some technology challenges. He says it's on. He says his video's on. Yeah? Brilliant. Okay. Some technological challenges we think have been overcome. Without much further ado, live from Germany, I'd like to introduce Professor Aldo Freisel, who many of you may know. He's a professor of AI and neuroscience at Imperial in the Department of Engineering. He's the founding director of the Centre for Doctoral Training in Healthcare at Imperial College, and he also leads the AI network. And here he is, Aldo.
Hi, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm very sorry to miss this launch in person. I was very much looking forward to this, and I was very excited when Dasha first mentioned this, I think over 1.5 years ago, that something like this could organize themselves here. I'm going to speak about AI and mental health, and I'm going to tell you a very personal story I had with the digital world in mental health, which happened last week when my phone fell into the water and basically lost all function. And because I'm a conscientious digital scientist, I have everything with two-factor authentication, which means that when you log in, you have to always get a text message and provide the text message password. So it was cut off from every single digital service, including emails and also this Teams channel still now. So I can tell you that had a significant toll on mental health, with bouts of loneliness because no one could reach me and I couldn't reach anyone. So without further ado, I want to talk to you a bit about the more serious aspects of what I believe we can do when we try to tackle challenges in mental health with the use of AI technology. And I suppose you can see my shared screen. And maybe it's worth talking about what we have in common with AIs, because most of you will come from a neuroscience/psychiatry background. And I think what we all have in common with AI system is what we call the perception action loop, namely the fact that your senses record the world, perceive it, then they translate that into some form of action, into behavior. For really the only way your brain can interact with the world is through some form of behavior that involves movement, be it to speak, to eat, to walk, and so forth. And so a challenge, of course, if we want to tackle problems in mental health is mental health suffering is a very personal and subjective experience. How can we try to perhaps use various methods from AI to objectify it? And now that I've spoken about the perception action loop, I want to convince you that machines suffer very much from the same challenges here. So when we're talking about artificial intelligence, what I'm usually talking about is the concept of a system that implements a practical solution to a real world problem. That is an AI to me. Machine learning, you may have heard also the term, and deep learning are methods by which we can construct AI systems. And these two terms are very popular now and have actually revolutionized how we do AI. There are other ways of doing AI, of course, because the idea is not that an engineer sits down and writes down the rule of how the AI should work, but the idea is that we have data that from which the machine, just like a child, learns how to perform certain things. And that leads us to the big questions of big data and related terminology, because we need to feed these machines. When we talk about AI, also in the context of helping us humans in the real world, we also need to be very clear what the purpose of AI is. Especially in the healthcare domain, and the practitioner amongst you can tell a much better story than me about that, is that effectively, with our rapidly aging societies, the demand for the clinical demand has simply exploded and is going to continue in its growth. And we're basically facing a shortage of the clinical supply, so to speak, and how much treatment, how much support we can give people. And the aim, and really the sole aim of AI systems in this domain, is for us to try to help the unmet demand through AI, ideally through systems that can, deal with larger scale simple problems, so as to free up the professional to focus on the complicated cases. When we're talking about AI, we can also talk about AI in a different way. And I usually pose AI as a question. Namely, the question is, how do I build a machine that can solve problems for which humans need intelligence? If you look at it from this question, then the most common form of AI in healthcare involves what I call perceptual AI. So perceptual AI is AI systems that mimic our perceptual abilities to make, for example, decisions. And so that's a very straightforward path. You have some equipment, environment, some operational setting where you're receiving information, and then somebody looks, feels, listens to it, and then makes a call about what happens. And so perceptual AI is predominantly deployed in settings of diagnosis and monitoring. And over the past few years, I'm sure you've all seen a fantastic array of different solutions that were published in high-profile publications across many areas of medicine, including neurology, but less so in the mental health domain. And I think there's a reason for that, is because what we had so far is many settings like the radiologists you see up here looking at a picture of, say, a brain scan, determining if, for example, there is a tumor or not, and then labeling that data. So we have, very large quantities of routinely generated data where we use the perceptual abilities of professionals to basically annotate that data, and then basically we can train systems. One of the challenges in the mental health domain is, of course, it's very difficult to capture that data, as there are very different ways by which we actually assess patients. So one performance improvement is a line of work that we've been following the past few years, and that's effectively the development of methods for high-performance diagnosis and monitoring in brain-related disorders. Now, I'm giving you 3 examples, none of which have to do with mental health. They're all neurological disorders, but I just want to give you the gist of a sense of what we can do to then basically link that to our very recent mental health work. So very often, you find that neurological assessments of any form are fairly laborious, and it takes a considerable amount of time to be able to detect, for example, if a patient has improved or not improved, or even to set a proper diagnosis. Even neuroimaging methods can suffer from the fact that to detect any form of change in a patient can take a substantial amount of time. And so this is, of course, always a problem when, say, you want to evaluate a new treatment, a new drug, a new therapy, and you basically need to wait for a very long time, which from a clinical trial perspective makes it very expensive before you can determine whether a patient has deteriorated or not. And so in this domain, we've been developing methods centered on behavior analytics. So the idea is effectively that we capture in some form human behavior as the ultimate output of the human brain, and basically try to develop markers that allow us to say how this patient is doing. And I give you here a very simple example. So imagine here there's a space of disease, and these 3 red dots characterizes a patient, type 3 patients that are sick, and then you have 3 patients that are healthy. And then very often we have a human-defined scale. Somebody a long time ago said, this is good or this is bad if you have a lot of this or not a lot of this. Say, if you sleep less than 6 hours or something like that. So you have some human-defined scale, and we're basically mapping all these different patients on this one scale. And very often we have some form of subjective assessment where I observe a patient and then decide how they're doing. So you have a bit of blur of how this dot is mapped onto this human-defined scale. So a first step is, of course, sort of to try to reduce the subjective eye assessment of patients using digital technology. And so one thing, for example, here is an assessment of children and in their developmental state by making them perform a defined set of very prescribed activities like standing on a leg, making them walk, perform some reaching tasks. And I'm contrasting you here, the same child, these are all children recorded in Great Ormond Street Hospital using our digital technologies while they're simply playing in the play area, waiting for their appointment. So it's a very great difference in how we're assessing patients with defined prescribed clinical assessments that may actually not be terribly related to their presentation in daily life. So the idea is if we can digitize things, we can effectively remove this human observer bias to some extent. But the problem is, for example, that if you look at these 3 patients here, they're still projecting onto an axis that completely overlaps with these 3 blue dots over here. And so, for example, in this region here, it's not very easy to quantify how a patient is doing. And if you want AI systems to work, you need to be able to quantify things, because only then these machines can start learning, changing, improving, or considering alternative pathways or options. So in the case of one group of patients, we can effectively then take this data that we collected in a cohort of over 40 children and observed their daily activities as well as how they're performing during clinical assessments, and then ask the machine, okay, is there a better way of resolving the blue group from the red group, the healthy from the non-healthy? And if you ask the machine, for the machine, it's fairly easy to basically say, okay, instead of using this human-defined scale that says, you know, this is good, this is bad, the machine can find a much better scale where the two groups clearly separate. It's not something that is intuitive to maybe a clinician or a therapist, for example, but it's something that the machine calculated is the best way of separating, given the data, these two patient groups. And now we're basically starting to talk about what we call digital biomarkers. So biomarkers that are defined from digital sources, but are now optimized by AI systems to separate, for example, or to distinguish disease progression. And so we can achieve these by the data-driven capture of human behavior in some form. And so once you've developed ways of capturing the data, then effectively we were very interested in developing methods that don't only work in a clinic, but work in daily life. So we can simply continuously observe children, and we've done it also with elderly patients in a stroke ward, and we've also done it with middle, 20 to 50-year-olds who suffer from another neurodegenerative disease. In fact, if you're taking these streams of these avatars moving around and convert them into behavioral fingerprints, and each fingerprint tell us a bit about how you're doing, and then basically combining these fingerprints together to form a diagnosis. And this gives us the ability to continuously, on a daily, on an hourly, on a minute-by-minute basis, monitor how a patient is doing. And for example, you may be aware that depending on the illness, patients may be in a more lucid or a less lucid state, and a more agitated or less agitated states, and we can start tracking and observing these differences. And I just want to show you some benefits of this technology, because of course, if we define a new biomarker, we still need to live and work in a clinical community that needs to know what our numbers mean. And of course, we can then define a back mapping that takes us from the digitally defined scale and allows us to refer back to some form of human defined scale, so we can communicate what these methods are picking up. And then we can communicate what we can pick up in addition to the defined measurements. So just to give you a few examples, we can make assessments of patients while they carry out these activities. We record their behavior, and we can, with a very good degree, basically, replace the assessment of observed by the human with that by the machine. That's fairly straightforward. But what we want to be able to do is assess patients not just when they're with the clinician or in the therapy session. We want to assess them in their daily life, because the patient's trajectories may vary. And so what we then did is we recorded the behavior of these people in their daily life on an hour-by-hour basis, and basically then develop markers that can also deal with the fact that patients may change state over time and meander a bit around in their behavioral state. And that allows us, for example, to now develop methods that can work even very powerfully on longitudinal predictions. So this is a marker for a disease. It doesn't actually matter for now what disease that is. What example I want to show you here is that effectively we can now make predictions on a disease where conventional clinical markers take a year to predict deterioration, and we can detect now deterioration within a 6-month period. And I'm showing you that in the following way. So here you see basically the number of subjects that need to have to resolve a certain amount of change in a patient. And so the lower this number, the better you're at resolving change in the patient. And you see that conventional clinical measures plateau at this unit measure of 60, whatever that is. And you see here how, with the number of patients that we have in our digital methods, we can basically achieve the same performance of precision in assessing a cohort's progression in disease with a much smaller amount of patients. and over a much smaller amount of time, namely exactly at the 6-month point. So this is just to evidence that we can do high accuracy measurement. I mentioned that I had a cohort of 20 to 40-year-olds. These were patients who suffer from a mutation. The disease is called Friedreich's ataxia. And here I'm just showing you a very interesting plot where we did also then with the collaborations, Richard Festenstein in Hammersmith, who's working on these patients, then also did gene expression analysis of the deficient gene. And basically we could show that our markers could actually express track on a patient by patient, event by event, or visit by visit basis their current gene expression levels of this damaged gene, while the both standard clinical measures, neurological measures that assess patients could not. And they were effectively not correlated, while we actually have a measure where we can go from behavior to expression of a gene that's not directly related to these effects. So what I want to show you is that if we use the right technology and we capture that technology and we can feed these machine learning algorithms and we develop appropriate algorithms that I'm not going to bore you with the mathematics of it, we can actually perform very high precision tracking. And we've now reached a state where we can even detect, for example, when patients are coming onto steroids, for example, for a week, we can detect that change in their behavior from, being a week on steroids and then being a week off steroids. So we can start going into the pharmacokinetics of patients on a daily basis. So that is fine. And that's really just basically trying to show what we can do if we want to look at diagnosis and monitoring of patients in a domain where we want to form diagnosis and monitoring. But really the challenge is treatment. And if you think about what a clinician does, treatment is really the big chunk of work where you need to plan, manage, and adjust. And it's here that we're going well beyond just diagnosing a patient with something. We need to do something. And this is settings that are closed loop, just like the brain I showed you at the start, where we have an interaction between the situation, what you're doing, and what the outcome is of what you're doing. And so actions have consequences, interventions have consequences, and you need to be able to start with deal with that. So in my lab over the past few years, we were able to do that. We started with a very non-neurological system. We started with diabetes and built an AI system that automatically for each patient in a very short amount of time optimized the delivery of insulin so as to find a better strategy for how to inject patients. In this case, these were rats, and then this was taken up by a company, Fresenius Kabi, to take that into the human system on how to automatically, optimally inject interventions. We then took this also into surgical settings where it was about the optimal delivery of anesthesia drugs to keep patients under, but not push them too far under, because of course, if you're too deep in anesthesia, that has negative consequences. And then probably more visibly in the last 2 years was the same work again, where we built an AI system that learned, in this case, from historical data of operational, hospital operational data, how to deliver drugs and IV fluids to patients so as to maximize their survival chance from sepsis. And this technology received the AI Health and Care Award from our previous health minister. And this technology is now taken forward into 4 separate hospitals across London. And you can imagine there was a substantial boost for ICU supportive technologies because of the recent pandemic. But going back to the domain where we want to do things that can help patients in a more mental category, if I simply have sensors on people, I can effectively start recognizing what they're doing. And so here you're seeing a patient in a stroke ward that we have been monitoring, and we can look at their activity profiles and effectively provide a way of a feedback interface to nurses and doctors looking at how this patient is doing and how is their mental state evolving. And this is joint work with Paul Bentley at Charing Cross Hospital. Now, this idea of being able to recognize and track behavior, even at this level of basically of these plots of what different activities do, led us to start working on what I call digital mental health. And you need to forgive me here, because this is all not clinical work. This is the difference between a vitamin supplement and an actual drug that you're prescribed, because this was work we've done entirely among computer scientists at the start. And only recently I had the privilege to start working with Dasha and her colleagues on taking this into the clinic. So what is the idea behind digital mental health? The idea is that we can exploit simple sensor systems like you have on your mobile phones, where we can obtain a lot of data in a very easy way, accelerometry data, how your battery is doing, how many calls you're doing, when you're unlocking your phone, what's the noise background without listening in, just knowing how loud it is, and so forth. And we started with a very crazy idea is maybe there's some relationship between the behaviors that your mobile phone collects and some form of things related to your personality. Now we're starting with the challenging aspects here is, can we reduce a human to a small set of numbers? And we can have many discussions about that, and I was personally very skeptical, but we simply picked one. It's called the Big Five personality traits. It's an established way of trying to simplify people to 5 numbers. And we basically gave a cohort of people the official Big Five tests, and we then convinced them to share this data with us, and we basically collected these 2 data sets, and then we started to see what we can do. And of course, the first thing that we tried is, if I don't know your personality just based on how your mobile phone is behaving or these signals from your mobile phone about your behavior, can I predict your personality? And that works surprisingly well. We're talking 75% accuracy per subject. So this means 3 out of 4, we can guess what your 5 personality traits are. And that was the good news, because it means that there is a link between personality and digital behavior. And so then we started asking ourselves questions. Okay, so what happens if I use the fact that I know what your personality is, I'm told that, and I know what your activity pattern is? Can we start now correlating whether your activity pattern and your personality are in match or in mismatch? In other words, when these people here, when it's easy for me to predict what your personality is, maybe it means that you're expressing your personality in your activities in a good, and you should be feeling good about that. And similarly, if your personality is in mismatch from the activities that you're actually doing, so saying basically maybe these 1 in 4 people we're misclassifying, maybe these are introverts who have to constantly give public lectures, for example, and it makes them feel miserable. So the idea is, can we start now to relate our predicted, what we predict your ideal activity profile should be, and contrast that for how your current activity profile looks like from the mobile phone. And so basically, it means we're building a model of you. That's what we call the reported personality that we get from a psychometric test. And in the future, now that we've validated that link just from your activity data, and then we simply can measure on a weekly basis, what is your activity distribution? How well does it match to your personality? And then see if there's a difference. And then what we did is we simply performed a subjective well-being assessment, more or less asking you, hey, how happy are you on a scale from 1 to 10 today? And this is the plot. What I'm showing you here is the difference in the happiness of the subjects. Sorry, on this thing here, we call this positive mental well-being, so that they experience. And what I'm showing you on the x-axis here is basically the difference that we computed by computing the difference between your ideal activity profile for your personality and your actual activity profile. So the fact that these 2 are correlated means, okay, there's a clear link between your activity profiles mismatch from your ideal one and your happiness. And then all what we started doing is deploying the technology by basically saying, okay, if you're mismatching your activity profile, why don't you change these things? Try to change these things. I'm not telling you go for a walk or go to the cinema or call a friend. I'm saying of all these things you could do, try to do more of these and less of these and see how it goes. And so we started doing that, and it actually turns out that it started working. And we did this first in Spain because the funder for that study was Telefónica. That's a Spanish mobile phone company. You know them here under O2. And then later we repeated that with an analysis of data from 256 people in the UK, and it still worked. More interestingly, from the Spanish data and the UK data, once we started combining them, we could then ask interesting questions around the fact, can I separate my analysis of your activity behavior based on your personality from your culture? So if we want to be stereotypic, maybe somebody from Colombia is a bit more motor active than the average British person, and these are all stereotypes, so forgive me for that. And maybe that's a confound. And actually, if we then train these models that we've built on each individual nation, we actually see that there are different factors important for the patients, for the different categories, and for how we can best detect if somebody's extroverted or if somebody's agreeable. And we can start distinguishing and separating personality from culture. And that's, I think, actually a very important aspect that may be relevant in the future analysis. And somebody's probably going to tell me that I'm off time. No? No one? Okay. Okay.
To message you, Aldo. I don't want to cut other people short, but it's very interesting.
Okay. So
can you wrap up in half a minute?
It's the penultimate slide. So I'm going to skip these slides and basically show you that we then did an analysis of how much personal data are people willing to share and so forth, and contrasted that with the analysis of people being able to basically do the personality assessment. And to our surprise, everyone was far more willing to give us a personality psychological test assessment instead of sharing the mobile phone data. And that was very interesting. And so what I wanted to show you basically here is how we can use AI technologies to move out of the lab into the wild, how to go from just observing things in the open loop and diagnosing them to start thinking about interventions in some way, and how we can move away from human induction to data-driven approaches to define disease and possibly in the future also define interventions. And I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Aldo. I was very reluctant to interrupt because it's so interesting, but needs must, because we want to hear from our other speakers. Thank you very much. And I should have introduced the second part of this afternoon by saying the idea here is just to showcase the different ways that the faculties might, or the different perspectives that the faculties might bring to the issue of mental health. So hopefully Aldo has whetted your taste buds about what AI and technology can bring to mental health. We're going to hear now from Lindsay Dewar, who is a senior research fellow in the IGHI and who specialises, amongst other things, in co-production. And she's a member of the steering group for the network and was one of the people who developed the website. Anything else I should say about you? And it very much follows on from what Aldo is doing. It's taking the sort of work that Aldo is talking about into the public health and clinical domains. So, Lindsay, over to you.
So thank you very much for inviting me today, Dasha. Actually, what I was going to start by saying was actually it's quite the opposite of what Aldo is saying, and actually it's very human focused I'm going to be talking about today, and really working together with people with lived experience. Essentially, as an early careers researcher, I've been really fortunate enough to work with people with lived experience, academics and clinicians, and people with different experiences from different settings. So, for example, my doctorate was looking at sleep in prison, for example, and my more recent work is looking at secure psychiatric inpatient care, as well as the community, as well as people who have not yet had a diagnosis of mental health conditions. And that's what I'm really hoping to achieve today with this talk, is sort to really showcase the experiences of those with lived experience, both from a public mental health and a clinical mental health perspective. So I always try and start with a quote in my talks, and this is one of the best ones for me. Nothing about us without us. And essentially, in a nutshell, it means that why is the research focused that is not with people about what the research is actually about. So in other words, research is carried out with or by people with lived experience and not on to or about them. So not as participants, but as research partners. You can see on the right-hand side here, this diagram, this is a type of involvement that what we call patient-public involvement. It can go from as little control and responsibility through consultations, all the way through to user-controlled involvement. A lot of my work is sort of bridging the two and what we call co-production, which I'll talk about in a minute. And essentially that's bringing the two together. So working together as research partners, as opposed to either one controlling the research. But why even bother? Why bother working with people with lived experience? And I've heard a lot of people be very skeptical about this throughout my career so far. And I would say the first thing is really it's a moral and ethical right for me. I do not understand why people would want to work without getting that lived experience from people that the research is actually about, because at the end of the day, that research is actually going to influence that person's life. And they have a right to be involved in that research. Also, different perspectives. It really is vital from a person that's minoritized, for example, for various reasons, from gender, from age, all different perspectives that will actually lead to different outcomes and different perspectives that are really just crucial for research to be effective and impactful. And talking of impact, one of the biggest things I hear is about actually it's going to be impactful if you work with people with lived experience. And that's more from the relevance of the research. They know what it's about. They're living that condition, that mental health condition, whether it's psychosis or bipolar disorder or depression. And actually it'll improve the quality as well. We know a lot from the ethics committees. They want you to be working with people with lived experience, but also the funders, and also most recently the journal articles. So the BMJ, for example, is a big push for patient and public involvement. So every corner you will be seeing this more and more. So talking of impact, I just wanted to showcase what we've seen so far in the evidence, as well as from the researcher and co-researcher's point of view. Because it's not just from the research, it can actually be impactful for the people as well. Weirdly enough, the evaluation of patient and public involvement has actually really been sort of in the perspectives of people in the last 10 years. So we still don't know a lot about it in the evidence. However, what we do know is that, for example, in clinical trials, there is an increased enrolment, for example, by working with people with lived experience. You actually can keep people in trials for longer and actually start them in the process in the first place. As well as qualitative research can be significantly improved in terms of triangulation, which is a lot of what we did in our co-produced work. And also the appropriateness of the research. So what I was saying before about the relevance, it's impactful for that and that person, not just the research. And you can see on the right-hand side here, there's a few quotes from researchers that I've worked with on our project, as well as the co-researchers. And I say co-researchers, these are people with lived experience of mental health difficulties, and they're co-researchers because it's a co-production approach. So it's just a few examples. I felt listened to and my ideas were valued. Empowered is not strong enough of how I felt. So they really did feel part of the research project together as research partners. And that's what we try and do all the way through our research. But why hear it from me? I've been fortunate enough to work with Caroline and Lizzie. First you'll hear from Caroline in a couple of minutes, and then Lizzie about what the research means to them and about working together with academics.
As a young person with lived experience of mental health difficulties, I have been involved with several projects at Imperial as a co-researcher. And being involved at every stage of each project has been really important to me, because I know that research is considerably more effective when it is co-produced with people who have lived experience of the conditions being studied. So, for example, in a recent study I worked on as a co-researcher, I was involved from the very beginning, contributing to the design and the content of the surveys that we sent out, and the questions we asked in our interviews, and coding the transcripts, and all the way through to the evaluation stage. And I know that this profoundly impacted the research because it meant that myself and other co-researchers had that crucial insight for knowing what's relevant and what's not, and what phrases would be inclusive, what topics to probe on in interviews, and the meaning of certain phrases that appeared in the transcripts, all of which could have been missed, without our input, or rather the research could have gone in a completely different direction that might not have been as useful to those who, the research is intended to benefit, So yeah, the impact of co-production is both important to me personally, but also for the research as a young person.
I've been involved in a range of different projects, ranging from eating disorders, the use of antidepressants in young people, my experience of CAMS, being sectioned, the role of therapists in therapeutic relationships, and most recently with Lindsay on the SPRAY project. My experience of being involved in research has been nothing but positive, both on a personal and more professional level. I feel like by contributing to my own experiences, I feel like I finally have a voice within the system. I feel like I'm heard, I'm understood. My thoughts, opinions, and ideas are all accepted and utilised, and they're a vehicle to making positive changes. I feel like it's given a purpose and a meaning to my experiences and a sense that young people actually matter. I feel like we're not just subjects to be passively studied, but we're active change makers, and we're helping to shape the mental health system for the future generations. I also believe that involving young people's lived experience undoubtedly adds value to the project. We know the details, the pitfalls, the barriers, the boundaries, and the holes in the common system and practice and research in a way that professionals on the outside just can't see. And we know all the gaps because we've been in the gaps ourselves. So we know what needs to happen in order to get out of those gaps and close them for the future generations. I really think that involving young people with experience is the future of research. The way that researchers listen to us and implement our ideas really feels like progression and a move towards a system where young people are equal to their elders and aren't suppressed and ignored because of their age.
So hopefully that's kind of, given you something to think about in terms of working with people with lived experience. So next slide here, I'm just wanted to focus a little bit more on the co-production methodology. So it is a bit different than patient and public involvement, which I know a lot of you in the audience do to an extent in different parts of the research cycle. But co-production is actually working together throughout all stages of the research cycle, not just one or two. And it's also working through these 5 principles on the right-hand side here. So you can see the different stages of the research project. So some of my colleagues would, for example, be informed by the research by working together with people lived experience on the protocol, on the design, on the information sheet, on the consent form, potentially through an application, so they'd be co-applicants, for example, and through sharing results, so dissemination, maybe working together on a video or an infographic, or actually how young people would want to see the information rather than an academic journal, which is really jargony and they're not bothered about that at all. So that's just a few examples. But as I say, co-production is different, and we're working through these 5 stages. So co-production, for those who do not understand, it's actually working together in equal partnership, sharing responsibility and power from the start to the finish of a research project. Sharing power is one of those first things you're trying to really get across from the start. And one of the reasons that this is so important is not giving emphasis to the practitioner or the academic, and that all views and experiences are equally valid, and that the academic does not lead and the clinician does not lead just because they're an academic and a clinician. So I'm not saying it's not challenging, because it is, because different voices are coming to the space, but it's absolutely achievable. Really need to dedicate time to building and maintaining relationships, and that's from the early start. So I would really suggest building that communication strategy together, how people want to be involved, and trying to inform decisions all the way through the research project together. So for example, we set up a WhatsApp group on many of our projects, and that's how the young people wanted to be communicated with, and we worked together throughout that research project, communicating any decision being made, never one person leading it. Yeah, and that really worked well for us. And also, in terms of the reciprocity, it's actually really making sure that the young people get something out of it too. So it's not just to inform the research, it's to help them as well. So not just for the outcomes of the research, but for example, training. So we've put on lots of co-produced training activities such as data collection in qualitative interviews and analysis of coding transcripts. And then we give the certificates, and this is completely something they can put on the CV. So it's a real back and forth approach, and just that everyone essentially gains something from the process. So as I say before, my research is a little bit different in that it really does capture the public as well as the clinical mental health. And I'm really coming from a translational angle with this as well. So my work can come from anything from promotion and public engagement. So for example, I'm working on a co-produced film at the moment, a drama series about actually highlighting the issues during COVID and youth mental health, and actually, again, how to translate that back into practice, what the young people and practitioners actually want to see, and how change can be implemented through that. As well as a health campaign, such as in minoritized young men, we know that mental health risk is higher, and also people are less likely to ask for help, and this campaign is trying to bring that more to the forefront of people's views and experiences, and doing that in different media, so through sport and boxing and music, as opposed to, again, this traditional sort of academic ways of doing things. Not that that's not valid, but it's just a different way of looking at things. And then anything from these lifestyle factors, it seems more and more my research through this prevention to the relapse prevention pathway across is that actually things like sleep, I've heard that a few times today, exercise and social connection, for example, these are all factors that we all share, and actually they're shared across the public and clinical platform. And someone who has not yet got a mental health condition might well develop a mental health condition, or a person with a mental health condition might get worse in their experience. And therefore, these are the sort of factors that actually can be used as early signs of deterioration. And my work seems to be more and more looking at these factors and actually using digital means to detect that deterioration. So this is just a bit of a snapshot of it. I haven't got time to go through every single project, unfortunately, but I did want to just highlight one of them. So in the last 18 months, obviously, we've had COVID, and very, very early on, a few of us decided actually really need to focus on mental health, not just the physical health consequences of COVID. And I'm sure everyone's more and more aware in the recent months how mental health has been more and more in the sort of the news about in relation to COVID. So we knew we wanted to focus on mental health, but we didn't know what we wanted to look at. And that's where the young people came in. So we worked with young partners from the start to prioritise the research question and where we wanted to focus our research. So we actually put it to the public, for the young general population, through social media and other avenues, to actually decide from 11 research questions that us and the research partners decided together. And they then decided on one research question, which is to look at the mental health and coping strategies of 16 to 24-year-olds during the COVID pandemic, and also to use a mixed methods approach. So again, I'm probably coming from a different angle to most people that have spoken so far. So I'm looking at qualitative research, so lots of textual responses to questions, as well as numerical as well. They were all involved from all throughout the research stage completely, all the way through to evaluating the impact. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. And we went through as an online survey first and then followed up with qualitative interviews. And the young people were trained in how to conduct virtual qualitative interviews, and we all interpreted the results together. So you can see here we've got a co-produced thematic map that we decided together, and we used all software that we could all access and all had equal responsibility for, so not one person led. We came up with these 3 main themes, and actually all of them are really just aspects of what I said before about these things that are applicable across all people, whether you've got a mental health condition or not. So those protective factors such as positive family connection, like I said earlier, and those prior experiences. So for example, someone that we talked to had a relationship that was at distance for a long time, so they were completely used to being apart from that person. Whereas others really struggle to be apart from their loved ones. Also, active ways to cope came up a lot. So sleep was one of those lifestyle factors that everyone really either took to or struggled with. I know that someone actually went to sleep more just to avoid the situation, which was really interesting, and then had actually done that previously as well. And then both people with lived experience of mental health difficulties and those who hadn't, their mental health had worsened. So the different aspects of that came up in the coding. So people with eating disorders, for example, their eating-related coping strategies worsened, and people with low mood also worsened. And actually this last theme as well, that everyone needed more mental health support, access was really low during COVID, and actually the digital platforms such as Zoom, for example, even though we had a lot of Zoom fatigue, actually was helpful in terms of providing that opportunity for support, and also peer support came up quite a lot. So this is just a snapshot of our co-production journey. I thought it's always best to do it in pictures. So here's a Twitter feed about how we actually raised that research question in the first place. And these are all our young people. So that's Caroline, Jack and Lizzie. And Lizzie and I actually were really fortunate enough to co-present quite a few times during the pandemic, and which was absolutely fantastic, and she's amazing. Yeah, and we got really good feedback from her being involved when we attended. And then we can see here with the post-it notes, we're doing the research together. We're, being able to manipulate them however we wanted. Again, online, it was quite difficult, but we made it work. And then you can see as part of the research cycle wheel, we actually went all the way through to improving health and services during the pandemic. And we actually, again, with a brand new group of 9 young people, we ran online workshops for the things that the young people in our research actually wanted to know more about and get help for, such as sleep problems, how to get a better routine, and how to ask for help during the pandemic. And then you can see on the right-hand side, evaluating impact was also one of those things we captured, both from a psychiatrist's point of view, from Martina, and also from the young co-researchers. So both really fully enjoyed the process and was impactful to both. I just want to finish with last couple of slides where I see a future in research going across the interface. I do think more and more it's about these factors that link us all together, such as sleep, but also working in more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teams. So not just clinicians, academics and young people, but designers, policymakers, charities, people in the third sector, primary care. Everything's connected, everything should be integrated as much as possible. And I can see this going into more co-design, testing, evaluating of digital and blended care. We know that digital has a space in mental health care, but it doesn't replace face-to-face. For more and more we talk to the young people, so there needs to be more of a blended approach. And honestly, I'm always got 2 hats on, trying to innovate and advance co-production and improve mental health for young people. And you can see on this right-hand side, this is just where I see co-production going. So there'll be more and more, as I say, working with these different groups, working more with minoritized young people, establishing best practice at Imperial for co-production, and across different settings, and to further advocate for the person and young person voice. And this is just my last slide. I just wanted to, well, second to last slide. I just wanted to give a sort of an overview of the recommendations in my 5 years doing co-production and working with people with lived experience. So one of the biggest things I could say is start really, really early on, and also match the person to the role. So the person needs to have that experience that your research is about to have the best impact. And also try and set up a communication strategy that everyone agrees on, and that therefore decisions can be made regularly together. And if anyone wants this slide, I can send it after. I just want to end with this quote: "Nothing about us without us." For any skeptics out there, I would ask you to reconsider. I just think that it's the way to go going forward, not just meaningful patient public involvement, but for co-production as best as possible. I just want to name and thank everyone for working together.
Thank you, Lindsay, so much for bringing the personal stories and experiences into this conversation. Lindsay, as you can tell, is also our key communicator, so she runs the Twitter handle for the network. So please do, all those of you who are tweeters, please do all follow the network on, I think it's Imperial MH _ Mental Health, MHRN, Mental Health Research Network. Thank you. So thank you very much, Lindsay. That was lovely. And thank you, Lizzie. Now, again, although the segue here is this connection with sleep. So now for something completely different. In fact, Bill Wisden, who's professor in natural sciences, tells me, in fact, he's not even a medic, he's a zoologist by background, but he's interested in all things sleep related, and is going to talk to us about sleep and its relationship with mental health from his perspective. Again, something entirely different.
Yes, I was also asked to talk about animal models. So we work on mice, just so you know. So mice are our partners in the spirit of the last talk, but they're mice. Okay, so this is, we all know what sleep is. We can all recognize someone asleep. If we had to define what sleep is, a reversible behavioral state, perceptual disengagement from an unresponsiveness to the environment. But frustratingly, but also interestingly, sleep scientists can't agree on the purpose of sleep. So right now we have to go to sleep tonight. The longer I keep you up, the bigger the drive to sleep. If I measured your brain waves to track the EEG, more on that in a minute, and I gave you, I say I'll pay you $500,000 to stay awake for 1 week. Some of you might take me up on that bet, but all of you will, including me, will go into sleep. And that's another thing that we work on in the lab, which is the biochemical basis of the sleep drive. I'm not going to show you that today, but in part it's a frustrating thing because we don't know the purpose of sleep, and I'm just going to give you a few things related to perhaps psychiatry today. So just a bit of a textbook thing. So we characterize sleep with EEG. I'm sure many of you probably know this, but as we go to sleep tonight, as humans, we go into non-REM sleep, which is characterized by delta waves of 2 to 4 hertz, and we have about 90 minutes of that. And then for a completely unknown reason, we move into REM sleep, where our muscles are paralyzed. It's because the motor neurons are inhibited, so we're in atonia, except fortunately you're breathing, still breathe, and this is often when you have dreaming, but also in non-REM, and then the EEG looks a bit like it's awake, and then for an unknown reason we move back into non-REM, and we humans go through multiple cycles, and then we wake feeling refreshed in the morning, after usually from REM sleep. And this REM sleep was only discovered in 1957. It's remarkable. All the humans, as I showed you, painting each other asleep, but we only worked out Kleitman and dement REM sleep by studying children in 1957. So this is a colleague, Van Sommeren in Amsterdam. This is how he studies human sleep, to get these brain waves covered in these beautiful kind of dispersed electrodes. But this is how we do it. I think David's doing sport. Anyway, this is how we do it in mice, actually. So you can get the same kind of EEG recordings in mice, and that's a little device called the neurologger. Here's Kleitman, the pioneer of sleep research in the bottom. This was in the 1950s. This is his own kind of sleep recordings. So we look at the same thing in mice, and this is such a basic physiology that you can make a strong argument that if you understand sleep in mice, you can understand at least a lot of it in humans. And this is an example from our lab of how we record the brain waves, the EEG, the frequency, and the muscle tone, the electromyogram. And we can then assign whether a mouse is awake in non-REM sleep or REM sleep. It was originally also called paradoxical sleep, REM sleep. And the only difference between mice and us is that they're dispersed sleepers. So they don't have a block of sleep like we will hopefully tonight for 7 to 8 hours. They have naps throughout the day and night, but they're a bit more active at night. And actually most animals are like that, that are mammals. So we and other primates are unusual in having a consolidated block of sleep. So to move into the bones of it, I'm sorry, these slides are actually smaller than I anticipated. I thought it was going to be a big screen, so it's easier for the people online to see this. But we're interested in sleep-wake circuitry, and without going into the details of this slide, we did a systematic screen with no hypothesis to look for new areas that keep us awake. And Zhao Yu in the lab found that there was one particular area which no one had studied for sleep, called the VTA, ventral tegmental area, which is a famous area for dopamine. It's on the right-hand column. And we found that when we activated it artificially, I won't go into the details about that, using a technique called chemogenetics, for mice, I don't know if you can really see that graph, but in the bottom right, the mice were awake for 7 or 8 hours after we stimulated a kind of neuron that made the excitatory transmitter glutamate. So there was a new type of circuit keeping us awake, the VTA, and this is where it is from a brain scan, for example, in the human brain. So it's in the heart of the midbrain, and David and other people talked about that earlier. It's making the famous dopamine involved in motivation, addiction, etc. But it's got a whole load of other neurons that have not been so studied, including glutamate ones and the GABA ones. And again, to miss out some crucial detail, we found that in the heart of the VTA, there's a type of neuron that makes GABA, which is the inhibitory transmitter in the brain. And if you stimulate those neurons, it produces a spectacular long-term sleep in the mice. In the bottom left-hand graph, the mice go into non-REM sleep if you artificially stimulate them using mouse genetics. And our laboratory was able to work out how it did that. It switches off dopamine, which is contributing to being awake, but it also goes to that thing, don't know if you can see it, called LH, which is the lateral hypothalamus. That makes a famous chemical called orexin, which is contributing to emotion and being awake. And these neurons in part inhibit the lateral hypothalamus. Now, you're wondering, what's all this got to do with psychiatry? If we actually kill those neurons genetically, so we can do this with a very precise expression of an enzyme called caspase, which kills just the neurons in the ventral tegmental area, the GABA neurons. These mice have a spectacular phenotype, which is that they're awake permanently 4 extra hours a day, which is like for us being like having 1/3 less sleep permanently. And this phenomenon persists through the lifetime of the mice. So we're using these mice to try to get at the purpose of sleep. But from the psychiatric angle, we're fascinated to know what that had on the, if you allow me the indulgence of saying psychiatric for a mouse, that was model, okay. We had also the indulgence of calling these mice manic because they're actually hyperactive. They have much less sleep, so they're not bipolar mice. And they had instances where we could use drugs used in the clinic to reverse their behavior. And so we think these neurons are involved in maintaining motivation used for acute survival. But if they're damaged, it actually seriously impedes the mice's ability to rest and to interact normally with other mice. And we found, again, apologies for the small graphs, that valproate, reversibly reduced the symptoms of both. It made them have normal amounts of sleep, and it reduced a whole load of criteria, which I'm not going to tell you about, which allowed us to call the mice, at least in this field, manic. So valproate was effective reversibly. When you took the valproate away, mice became hyperactive again, but lithium didn't work in this context. And we were able to show, I'm not showing you the data here, that this partially involved the dopamine system and the lateral hypothalamus. So these GABA neurons, they're called VGAT in this diagram. That's a genetic label for these neurons that make GABA. When they're not there, there's just a tiny population right in the middle of our brain. When they're not there, a whole load of behavior is unrepressed permanently, including lack of sleep, and partially through dopamine, but also through other systems. So they're right at the heart of something important. So just the last part of my lecture is about REM sleep. I was concentrating on non-REM sleep back there, and REM sleep is the dreaming stage. So there's all kinds of romance about REM sleep. This was the famous Freud, the purpose of sleep was dreaming and wish fulfillment. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, and it's made into a thing, Hitchcock-Dali collaboration, Spellbound. This is still worth looking at. This film has got a fantastic scene where they simulate dreaming. We don't believe in Freud anymore, at least I don't, the modern sleep researchers, but it's nevertheless clear that in REM and to some extent non-REM you enact out stories. Does that have any point? In REM sleep, often we can't remember them. Coming back to the psychiatric angle, there's a lot of evidence that after people have experienced trauma, for example, in post-traumatic stress disorder, REM sleep is enhanced. And so one way of looking at this is a form of depression, but quite a lot of sleep scientists are suggesting that the enhanced REM is actually beneficial and a way of dealing with trauma. And in my remaining few slides, I'm going to show you work where we're sort of building up to that. So first of all, the circuitry that governs REM sleep is quite complicated and we don't understand it all. Our lab has, this is unpublished work, has found a new type of brain circuitry which is exclusively REM active. And one of these neurons is in a subnucleus of the basal ganglia called the globus pallidus. Again, apologies for it being so small. It's even small for me. But take it from me that these neurons, when we could genetically image them, they're using calcium activity. They're only active during REM sleep. We were surprised to find another group. This is Marcus Stevenson Jones. They published a paper in Nature years before we were studying this, that these particular neurons were involved in allowing a mouse to decide whether an experience was good or bad. And so they had this Nature paper in 2016, and Marcus Stevenson Jones is now a group leader at the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre at UCL on neural circuits. And very briefly, what his group did was they had this kind of choice test for mice. So a mouse has got to choose, it's a slightly thirsty mouse, and it's got to make a choice between left and right in this diagram, and then sometimes it gets a drink and sometimes it doesn't. And it registers disappointment, if you like, when it's a negative experience. And what they found was that this particular neurons that we're studying in REM sleep, plus other neurons I'll show you in a minute, the whole circuit becomes more active when the mouse is disappointed, and it reduces the release of dopamine. That's the red arc there. Don't worry about all the details, but when the mouse gets a positive reward, this circuitry fires less. Now, it turns out that that circuitry is identical to the new circuitry we've discovered that is selectively active as well in REM sleep. Here's the same circuitry from Wade Barr in the lab that's been discovering this, and the little trace on top shows some of our genetic assays for calcium so that we can see these neurons are selectively REM active. And the circuit is the same circuit that Marcus Stevenson Jones discovered for registering activity when the mice experience disappointment. So we thought this must be more than a coincidence that this very specialized group of neurons, which involves the globus pallidus, lateral habenula, VTA, and the lateral hypothalamus, they seem to be active at that time. And we found, Wade-Barr's found, that if you genetically manipulate this circuit, you can selectively reduce or increase REM sleep. And so, for example, if you reduce REM sleep genetically by manipulating the globus pallidus neurons, mice spend more time, they become more anxious. And you can pick that up in the one of these mazes I'm showing you here. But we're now collaborating with Marcus Stevenson-Jones at UCL. So our idea, this is my last slide, I think, is that this circuit, it's involved in becoming active during negative experiences, and it implements REM sleep. So to be simplistic, like in some kind of negative impression, you get more REM sleep. Obviously, that sounds a bit simplistic, but we're struck by the coincidence of this circuitry and the Marcus Stevenson-Jones circuitry. And so we think somehow REM, recovery sleep, is contributing to reducing processing stressful events. So finally, I'd just like to acknowledge my funding, which is Wellcome Trust and the UK Dementia Research Institute. Lots of people have helped in this work, but I've presented mainly today work of Wade-Barr, and I share my lab. I should also say Zhao Yu, who did the earlier VTA work, and I share my lab with Nick Franks here at Life Sciences at Imperial. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was absolutely fascinating. And now I'm curious, and I want to ask a question. As the mother of a 15-year-old, I think he's chronically sleep deprived by having to get up at 7 a.m. And I'm wondering if that might account for why adolescents struggle so much with their mental health.
Well, that's an excellent. Oh, that's not on. It's an excellent point. That's like Russell Foster at Oxford. So that's a circadian thing. So he argues that children, especially teenagers, should start school later. It's actually better. And then when you're older, you become an owl. But there's partly genetic reasons. But I mean, in the end, it's a kind of torture to make children go to school if their brain's not working. But that's the circadian thing rather than a sleep thing per se.
Anyway, thank you. I'm going to make an executive decision because our next speaker is a pre-record. And therefore, I think it's probably, rather than keep our guest speaker waiting, it's probably opportune to move straight to Kathy if she's ready. If she's not ready, maybe we could take a couple of minutes just to see if anybody has questions for any of the speakers. Actually, I see Paul Matthews is back, Lindsay's here, Bill's here, David's here. Aldo's not, unfortunately, but has anyone else got burning questions that have arisen from anything this afternoon while I just check with Kathy Creswell with whether she's ready to go? Oh, Kathy's ready. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. We will show the video that Aradazi has recorded. We asked him to talk a little bit about the opportunities for interdisciplinary research. So hopefully, but I do want to make sure that we don't keep Kathy waiting. Unfortunately, Kathy Creswell was unable to join us in person because her son developed COVID, and she thought it was probably best not to expose us all to that risk, which is very thoughtful of her. But it does mean that yet again, it's going to be a Teams experience. Maybe for those online, it will be as good as experience, if not better. So Kathy, I can't remember how she was a trainee 100 years ago at Great Ormond Street, a very junior assistant psychologist, trainee psychologist, and she's now a professor of developmental psychology at the University of Oxford. She is particularly known for her work in the treatment of anxiety in children and adolescents, and has published numerous best-selling books on the subject, developed online parenting programs and so on. But one of many reasons why we invited her here today is that she's also the lead for the NIHR-funded Emerging Minds Network, and hopefully will say something in her comments about the power of networking for improving research collaboration. Kathy, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dasha, and thanks very much for having me. And I am really sorry not to be there. I was really looking forward to getting together with you all in person, but I guess this is how it's going to be for a little while longer. Hopefully you can see my slides. I can see them there. I don't know if it's possible for someone to spotlight them, so my face is smaller and they're a bit bigger. Is that working? Brilliant. Great, thanks very much. So yes, absolutely, I will be talking about exactly what Dasha just said, and really talking about mental health research networks and why I am a fan of them based on my own experience. And so I've been really excited to hear about all the work that's going on there at Imperial this afternoon, and I can see great potential through this network. So I was going to talk to you particularly about the Emerging Minds Network, which is a UKRI funded research network plus, which means that we have funds to bring together the network, but also funds to actually support some research ourselves. But just to tell you a bit about the network, so Emerging Minds essentially is a research community, as you're building there, and our members come from across disciplines and across sectors, so very much a similar model to what you're developing. And we have a shared aim to reduce the prevalence of mental health problems among children and young people within our network. And you can see there are lots and lots of logos, because I think one of the really critical things has been that our leadership team is made up of academics from across a number of different locations around the country who represent a range of different disciplines, but also a number of voluntary and community sector organisations. And we also have a number of young people and parents and carers who are key members of our leadership group as well, which makes an absolute critical difference to everything that we do. So what do we do as a network? How do we try to develop the community? Well, there are some very simple things. So we have a regular newsletter. If you are interested in child and adult mental health, do sign up. It really is packed full of opportunities to hear about, to develop research and develop networks. And but also we do have funding to deliver small grants to kickstart research collaborations, and I'll say a bit more about this, as well as support for special interest research groups. And actually the special interest research groups are something that we've launched fairly recently, but we're really pleased with, and so I'll tell you a bit more about that as well, because I think they're a really great way to push forward interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration. We've also supported cross-sector fellowships for early career researchers, setting up a development programme for early career researchers, have had a number of paid internships for early career researchers, and run various training events and produce resources, and throughout have extensive sort of paid opportunities for young people, parents and other key stakeholders to get involved. So I'll talk about each of these things as I go through, but sort of illustrating this through some of our some example activities of what we've done so far. One of the key things that we did right at the beginning is work with our partners Young Minds and the Centre for Mental Health to co-develop research challenges and support for projects to address our challenges. So it's been really important for us to have a very clear mission and also very clear areas of focus that we've then organised the rest of our activities around. And it's great to follow on from Lindsay's talk earlier and to hear from Lindsay and Caroline and Lizzie about their experience of co-development and co-production. And hopefully now I don't need to convince you why that's a good idea. You'll all be fully on board with that. But essentially, we started off the network by working very closely with young people, with parents and carers, and with people that work with children and young people, so a broad range of stakeholders. And we held a number of consultation meetings to try to identify what the children and young people, their parents and carers and key stakeholders all felt were the most critical questions that we focus our activities around. And through that work, we did identify 4 main questions that we've been working on. The first is called the big question, and this is really about implementation. So we know a reasonable amount about what works and how we can help address some mental health problems in children and young people, but is that being implemented in practice? Well, often it's not. And so for that reason, we really need to understand what the barriers are there and how they can be addressed. So how do we implement effective promotion of good mental health, but also prevention and early treatment of mental health problems at scale amongst children and young people? So you'll see that across all of our work, the focus tends to be on mental health promotion, prevention, but also early treatment, because again, these are the things that families really emphasise to us were really important. And I think, as we heard from Lizzie earlier on in Lindsay's video, you know, the sort of many families talk to us about the huge gaps and roadblocks that they hit in the system, and actually really talked about wanting to get help as early as possible when it's first needed. So that's a theme that runs across everything that we do. The next question is titled Embracing Complexity, and this was really a recognition that it's quite unusual that people come along with one clear, clearly defined, discrete mental health difficulty, but actually people often have complex and overlapping challenges in their lives, and so and sometimes then people can fall between gaps between services because they don't seem to fit neatly into one. So the question here is, how can we best meet the needs of children and young people who have intersecting needs and face complex situations? The third priority area is called Voices, Power and Attitudes. And this is quite broad, but basically covers how can we amplify young people's voices and change societal attitudes in ways that positively impact on children and young people's mental health. And finally, there was a real recognition that obviously children and young people spend a lot of their time around other people, and that potentially creates a great resource to support young people with their mental health, whether that be in schools, in youth clubs, in families, with peers, and so on. So here the question is, how can family members, friends, and other settings, such as schools, be better enabled to promote good mental health and prevent and overcome emerging mental health problems in children and young people? So through doing this work with Young Minds and Centre for Mental Health and doing extensive consultation, we developed these particular priorities, and those have really guided everything that we've done from here on. So first of all, our first funding call focused on 3 of those challenges, and we funded the projects you can see here. So 6 small projects, which we were really delighted to see really took up the challenge of supporting early career researchers to develop research and bringing together people from across different disciplines and across different sectors. The involvement of early career researchers we felt has been really critical, because actually we have such a huge problem with research capacity in mental health research. There have been times when funders have put out specific calls for mental health projects and really received very few applications because there just aren't that many people doing mental health research, and we need far more. So the creating opportunities for early career research and development has been really critical to everything we've done. So we were really pleased to see that across all the applications that we received in this first funding call, 3/4 of them had early career researchers in the applicant team, and actually many had early career researchers as the principal investigator with support from a senior colleague. You'll see almost 3/4 were multidisciplinary application teams, and about 2/3 had cross-sector involvement. And all of our calls, we've really tried to encourage people to address these particular issues. In the first call, we found there were very few funded applications for the Voices, Power and Attitudes challenge. And from talking to young people at the time, it became clear that the impact of racism, particularly, and societal attitudes around race had the potential to have a profound impact on young people's mental health. And so we decided to focus our second funding call around that specifically. So we funded an intern who came to work with us for 3 months, Fiore, who you can see here, who's now gone on to do a PhD, which is wonderful news. And she conducted a rapid scoping review to identify what we know about the impact of racism on young people's mental health in the UK. And the short answer is not very much. She also ran with some other young advisors online workshops for young people and some priority setting workshops for stakeholders. And off the back of that, we supported a new special interest research group focused on racism and youth mental health and ran a funding call. And we are now setting up 3 further awards on this specific area. So we were really delighted. And I think our main experience from that was, having paid interns who can come and help us kickstart some of these priority areas is a really good way to go to both increase research capacity in particular areas, but also to get key bits of work done. Because I think probably one of the main things that I've learned from all this is we all have lots of ideas, but we don't have a lot of time. And if you really want things done, you need to get people in to do them. Our current funding call, which is opening soon, is focused on the big question, which you'll remember is all about implementation. And so we have another intern working with us currently, Abby Thompson, who, again, I'm also hoping will be going on to do a PhD after this internship. And this is focusing on evidence-based commissioning. So also conducting a rapid scoping review and lots of priority setting workshops for stakeholders to understand what the real challenges are around evidence-based commissioning. We also have a new special interest research group focused on this area, and the funding call will be coming out soon. So do keep an eye on our website if that's an area of interest to you. So you can see there are priorities and how we've been addressing them through research funding calls. And I have to say, I mean, all of our research fund grants that we're giving out are fairly small compared to what you would get from many other funders. But it's really about helping sow the seeds, pump prime research that hopefully will then go on to get further support and grow from having this initial funding to get it going. So another activity that we've been really focused on is developing the research community focused on youth mental health across sectors and disciplines, so very much in line with your own objectives. One of the ways that we've approached this is by trying to give early career researchers opportunities to better understand how to work effectively with cross-sector partners. So far we've hosted 3 early career researchers where essentially we cover the cost of the person not being in their job or in their PhD to go and work with a cross-sector partner. And we've so far hosted placements with the Embracing Complexity Coalition, NSPCC and Childline, and the Centre for Mental Health. And these have universally been really, we've had really positive feedback, both from the hosts and from the placement holders themselves. So here you can see Pam Miller from NSPCC said, the placement was an amazing experience which brought much value and benefit. We hosted a great researcher who brought in elements to the project that we wouldn't have done otherwise. For example, co-production of the research with young people. As a result of the placement, we now have valuable insights for staff who develop and moderate the message board. This was the Childline message board, and pilot data to underpin further work, and have identified further areas to explore. And actually, in all cases, these cross-sector placements have led to ongoing partnerships and funding bids between these researchers and the organisations. So if you have the opportunity in the network, this is an approach I would really encourage. We've been really impressed by how well everyone has taken it on. We're also encouraging interdisciplinarity through a further internship. So we've just taken on a further intern within Emerging Minds, who is someone who comes from a design research and practice background. And as she says here, this is Kaylee, and she's working for us over the next few months, exploring and reviewing how design-led approaches and methods can encourage new ways of thinking about working with children and young people to promote and support good mental health. So by bringing people in from other disciplines, giving them experiences with mental health research, we hope that this can help, take hopefully Kaylee, but others too, in new directions. And as I mentioned, we've also supported now 18 special interest research groups. And here what we do is we support through funding the involvement of people with lived experience in the research groups, because it's obviously really critical, as we've heard from Lindsay, that people with lived experience are at the centre of these discussions about developing new research. But the difficulty is often that there's no funds available to pay those people for their time until you've got a grant. So by providing the funds for the lived experience representatives to be involved in these groups and to work with academics and people from other sectors, it's created the opportunity for people to come together. So we have now, as I said, 18 funded special interest research groups covering a broad range of areas that fit with our overall priority areas. And we regularly host meetings to bring them all together, share ideas, so that they can all make the best of this opportunity. We're just also launching an open lab session, so we're going to carry on with the online meetings if people can bear it, and have monthly online meetings for sharing research, sharing practical guidance, and also informal discussion, and to basically find new ways to keep building networks for people across the country who are interested in our priority areas. And I also just wanted to highlight that one of the other things that having a network enables you to do is to be able to respond quickly when challenges come along. And obviously, we're all very familiar with the recent challenge of of the pandemic, myself very much so right now. And so I wanted to also illustrate how having the Emerging Minds Network enabled us to respond very rapidly to the pandemic. So the first thing that we did was to very quickly pull together experts across the network to produce guidance for families. So that included a resource that you can see here about supporting children and young people with worries about COVID-19. And this was very rapidly translated into about 20, I think, different languages just because of the connections in the network. And we also put together with the mental health a series of webinars for parents, carers and people that work with children and young people about managing common difficulties that were arising when we were in the first lockdown. And again, we were able to really draw on the members of the network who had different areas of expertise that could really make a useful contribution at that time. And we also worked with a voluntary community sector organisation called Debating Mental Health to work with a group of girls from Didcot Girls' School in Oxfordshire, which is a local state school. And we worked with young people who identified themselves as having difficulty public speaking and essentially trained them in public speaking and having a friendly, not adversarial debate about how to build a mentally healthy world post-COVID. And these young people did an absolutely phenomenal job and ended up being very heavily quoted in an all-party parliamentary group report on the COVID generation. So again, drawing on those existing relationships with schools and with charities enabled us to respond quickly. And we also were able to quickly pull together the co-space study. And the co-space study has been tracking children and young people's mental health throughout the pandemic. So starting in March last year, we started to survey parents and carers of children aged 4 to 16 and also young people themselves who were aged 11 to 16 years. And essentially, sorry, I've just noticed there's a missing slide there. Strange. But essentially what we found was that when you look at the whole sample together, you can see things are fairly stable, but with some fluctuations in the grey panels, which were when we were in lockdown periods. The thing that's been most but the thing that's really important to say, and that this is the slide that was missing from here, is that this isn't a representative sample. We can't draw conclusions about prevalence of mental health problems. However, what we can do is look at how amongst this sample things changed over time, and also how that changed differently for people with different characteristics. Because through working with our networks and all of our voluntary community sector partners who were able to distribute information about the survey very widely, very quickly, we were able to get a big uptake. So about 10,000 parents have taken part in this survey, and with quite diverse demographic characteristics because we were able to use these national networks. And also, just to say, it also meant we had very rapid access to patient and public involvement at the beginning because of the existing network. So as we saw, when you look overall, things are quite stable. When we split things by age, you can see a little bit more variability. So particularly if you look at the sort of behavioural difficulties and attentional difficulties, you can see the primary school age group in our sample, you saw more dramatic shifts in mental health difficulties during the lockdown periods. And then when we look at other groups here, for example, in the red line, you can see families living on low income. So these are families living on less than £16,000 a year. And essentially what you can see is that difficulties are elevated amongst that group throughout the pandemic. And then when we look at children and young people with special educational needs, you see the same sort of pattern. So this elevated pattern of difficulties throughout the pandemic. And some of the things that are particularly noticeable is towards the end here, as other groups started to see a reduction in difficulties as we came out of the most recent lockdown. We didn't see that reduction in difficulties amongst those groups who were known to be at higher risk before the pandemic and have clearly continued to be at risk throughout the pandemic. So that study was something we were able to do very rapidly because of the existence of the network. Just to say a little bit more about that, one of the other things that we've been looking at is that the previous study obviously looks at mean change over time, but we could see amongst that there were different groups that had very different experiences. We also wanted to understand how the trajectory of people's experience may have changed throughout lockdown. And so this is data here from April to July last year, where children and young people were in lockdown. And essentially what you can see is in the red line, these children were completely fine, pretty much in terms of these mental health symptoms. So here we're looking at hyperactivity and inattention all the way through lockdown. And actually this accounted for about 2/3 of the children. But more worryingly, you have two other groups who either had stable high levels of difficulties all the way through, or who went from low to high as we went through lockdown. And the really important thing is obviously then to be able to look at, well, who are those young people? Because I think we all know this, that, you know, we were all in the same storm but very different boats. So there's one group here who were in a very comfortable, well, maybe not comfortable, but you know, a big liner that was able to stay afloat. And then there's these two groups here who've struggled more. And essentially when it comes to hyperactivity and inattention, these groups were characterized, they were more likely to be boys, living on very low incomes, younger age, to have special educational needs or neurodevelopmental disorders, and also their parents reported higher levels of psychological distress, more conflict with the child, and lower family warmth at the baseline measure. We saw very similar sorts of things with conduct problems and emotional symptoms. Essentially, there's different trajectories where you have a half to 2/3 of the children and young people doing quite well throughout, others struggling throughout, and others things getting worse, and some things getting slightly better. And what was similar across all of these were actually we saw quite similar predictors, and in particular these parental measures, and also low income and special educational needs and neurodevelopmental disorders were all risks for a more problematic pattern as lockdown went on. So, but from these early findings, we were also able to draw on the network to respond to those quite rapidly. So we're still running two quite large randomized controlled trials that came out as a result of these early findings. So the Sparkle trial is led with colleagues from King's College London, and essentially this is looking, because we found that parents reported high levels of stress and there were concerns about children. We saw particular elevations in children's behaviour. We rapidly co-produced an app for parents of children in the general community, and have now distributed that in a randomised controlled trial where about 300 families have had the app, and about 300 will get it a bit later. And we're now following up those families to see how they're getting on, with the view that, one, we've been able to get help to people quite quickly now, but also should we be in a similar situation again, it provides rapid remote support at a population level. And because child and adolescent mental health services have really struggled with having to provide support in this very difficult context, and had to very rapidly be able to provide remote support that's also efficient with the increases in demand for services, we're also running a large randomised controlled trial in child and adolescent mental health services around the country. So here we're working with about 50 clinical teams around the country to evaluate an online intervention, therapist guided intervention for child anxiety problems in the context of the COVID context, but this time within services rather than at a population level. And just finally, we also, sorry, I'm being slightly thrown because it turns out this isn't my most recent set of slides, so I have to fill in the gaps. But essentially, because we also found that although when we look as a whole, the teenagers in our co-space sample reported quite stable symptoms. In our qualitative work, they also described a number of challenges, particularly around managing uncertainty, dealing with isolation, of managing feelings of boredom and lack of motivation. And so off the back of those findings, and working again with members of the Emerging Minds Network, we were supported by the MRC to do a knowledge mobilisation project with a number of our partners, again including Young Minds and the Centre for Mental Health, as well as BBC Bite Size Headliners and Fully Focused, a fantastic youth-led film company, to create resources with young people, for young people, to help them as we move forward through the pandemic and also and beyond. I just wanted to, hopefully I've still got time, just quickly also mention another initiative that I lead, which is the NIHR Mental Health Research Network, because this is another way to connect up with other people, but I hope also can provide some useful resources for you as you develop your network. The NIHR Mental Health Research Network is all about trying to support the mental health research workforce, and to build that through highlighting the opportunities that are there, providing people with examples of how other people have navigated their careers and had opportunities, and also to provide useful information and help people connect up and to build collaborations. So on the website, we cover a number of things, including an interactive map where if you are a mental health researcher, you can add yourself on, and it enables you to quite quickly find people from different disciplines and in different locations around the country. So please do have a look and put yourself on there. You can also find lots of examples of mental health research career case studies. So these hopefully are helpful for sharing with early career researchers, but also people at other stages in their career, to help them sort of see the challenges others have faced and how they've overcome them. And hopefully to sort of help see that, you know, all of us doing mental health research, you know, are generally like everybody else. So hopefully people can relate and can see that, you know, this could be a good career route for them. And also we're active on Twitter, so have a look at us on there, MHR Incubator. This week we're having a Twitter takeover from a research clinical psychologist, but we generally share information and opportunities. And you'll also find on the website videos and so on, giving top tips for things like applying for fellowships. And one of the new things that we've just added is also lots of information about lived experience researchers, with some fantastic case studies of lived experience researchers talking about their own experience, which I think is helpful for any lived experience researchers you may be working with, or if you're a lived experience researcher yourself, but I think also very helpful for all researchers to read, to understand a little bit more about how that experience can be. So please do have a look at us there on Twitter, but also have a look at the website to find out a bit more about the Mental Health Research Incubator. So hopefully what I've got across from all of these things is that, you know, the work that we've done in the Emerging Minds Network, and also more recently with the Mental Health Research Incubator, have really created an amazing amount of opportunities, I think far more than any of us would have thought at the beginning. And particularly, you know, to allow people to connect, to collaborate, to access training and development opportunities, and for us to build research, much needed research capacity in the mental health area, and also to make sure that the research that we're doing has an impact through working very closely with broad ranges of stakeholders. So I'll just stop there and just want to say congratulations to you for initiating this really exciting network, and good luck. I really look forward to seeing what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. You've set the bar very high for what networks might achieve. I'm slightly daunted by that. It just reminds me that there was a request from somebody in the audience that slides were shared. So I'm hoping that speakers might be willing to allow their slides to be seen. I'm seeing a few nods, but there were some very useful slides amongst Kathy's. We're going to go back on the programme now and hear a few words from Lord Aradazi.
As a clinician and a former policymaker, I have known firsthand that there is no health without mental health. And I have seen the burden of mental health in children, adolescents, and adults. And it's very clear to all of us that the advances in physical health that we have witnessed in our careers have not been fully matched in advances in mental health. Amidst this current global crisis, many people are struggling with significant mental health, financial, social, and physical health burdens. And the potential toll has come to the forefront of our minds. This in turn brings an opportunity. Tackling mental health, however, cannot be addressed effectively if we act as individual disciplines. These complex, multifaceted challenges call for different stakeholders to work together and add value. And so the formation of this network is a key. There is much more potential for interdisciplinary collaborations across our Imperial network. And coming together to shine a light on the mental health work being carried out, we will hear today from a wide range or cross-section of academic researchers from across the college, the NHS and beyond. each with their unique, valuable perspective. The Institute of Global Health Innovation, or IGHI, has had a strong record of transforming healthcare through innovation, particularly in supporting digital innovations and driving health policy. We have recently expanded our portfolio of work to explore aspects of mental health in relation to healthcare delivery. Following on from the work that IGHI was engaged with in evaluating the impact of the Royal Foundation's Heads Together campaign, I was delighted and certainly a privilege to join the Duke of Cambridge to support the launch of Shout, an incredible service that complements the meaningful work done in other areas of the charity sector and by the NHS mental health services. In particular, the service has the unique power to reach segments of the population who historically haven't wanted to engage or being able to access to traditional services, and provide unrivaled insight into why so many people, particularly the young, are suffering with mental health problems today and how best to help them. In this context, the Shout 24/7 digital crises text is a vital service, while the data it captures also offers a unique opportunity to gain insight into the UK's mental health needs and the impact of Shout. We were privileged to have partnered with Mental Health Innovations, the digital charity behind Shout, which has enabled collaborations, development of unique anonymized dataset of nearly 500,000 conversations between a Shout texter and a Shout volunteer. This provides a window into the issues faced by people across our nation, particularly the young, and providing invaluable evidence based for service development to support mental health. Our partners from the College's Centre for Mathematics of Precision Healthcare and Data Sciences Institute are developing and applying cutting-edge machine learning and natural language processing algorithms to this data. This has enabled us to successfully predict texters' suicidal ideation and learn more about the people who use Shout and the impact of the service. Such insights will help Shout and the mental health sector respond to large and rising mental distress faced by many, and we will work in partnership to do so. To help Shout texters understand how we use their anonymized data to help others and to ensure our research is tailored to their needs. We've run a number of public engagement and involvement events. These include online workshops with users of Shout and digital charity The Mix, helping to improve the information about data usage on platforms. The project is also working in partnership with Shout and the West London NHS Trust to develop a programme of work that will improve access and suitability of mental health care for young, undeserved communities, particularly people of colour and those identifying as LGBTQ communities. We will continue to use Shout data and work alongside these young people to connect community and the NHS care, ensuring people have access to the right help at the right time. Another recent example is our ongoing work on climate change. A collaboration with the Grantham Institute, Climate Change and the Environment, one of our fellow global institutes at Imperial, in which we are exploring relationships between climate change and mental health. We have convened an interdisciplinary partnership of researchers, designers, policymakers and educators, working across Imperial and beyond to understand and support mental health in the current climate and ecological crisis. Overseen by my fellow IGHI co-director, Dr. David Nabarro, our vision is for individuals, communities and healthcare systems to have the knowledge, tools and resources to become resilient to the mental health impacts of climate change. And to date, we have hosted a seminar with global leaders, established an international advisory board, and also carried out a number of public engagements and involvement activities. The impact of changes to our climate is at a crisis point and damaging the mental health of hundreds of millions of people around the world, but the huge costs are hidden. Heat waves are increasing rates of suicide. Extreme weather, such as floods and wildfires, are leaving victims traumatized, and loss of food security, homes, and livelihood is resulting in stress and depression. Anxiety about the future is always also harming people's mental health, especially the young. Mental health conditions already affect 1 billion people and cost trillions of dollars a year. And global heating will worsen the issue unless action is taken. It is a vicious circle where climate impacts increases mental health difficulties, leaving people even more vulnerable to the future consequences. Higher temperatures are tied to depressive language and higher suicide rates. Fires and hurricanes and heat waves carry the risk of trauma and depression, and we have begun to compile evidence supporting the view and the impact of mental health as a consequences of climate change, which is mounting. Our recent policy report in this area provided an essential summary for governments and healthcare services alike, underlying that without urgent action, the planetary crises will impact all aspects of health for generations to come, and that the climate crisis is affecting the mental health and well-being of hundreds of millions of people around the world. These impacts are currently hidden costs, unaccounted for in terms of policy, planning, a situation that needs to be addressed and addressed urgently. Our findings have since been featured in articles in The Guardian, The New York Times, providing examples of the potential national and international impact of our mental health work, working with our partners and collaborators in the college. In summary, the launch of the Mental Health Research Network at Imperial provides a fantastic opportunity to enhance the visibility of the work in this strategic area of importance for the college, and I very much look forward to hearing about some of the tangible future outputs that I'm sure both new and exciting multidisciplinary collaborations will bring about. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. So I'm Anne Lingford-Hughes. I'm actually head of the Division of Psychiatry. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work with addictions. You've heard my name a few times, work very closely with David Nutt. In fact, I first met David rather too many years ago when I was actually a medical student. He was one of my teachers. And I think it was by meeting somebody like David who's brought me through the career, through into sort of mental health. It wasn't at all on my radar when I started in the field of either research or clinical, but it actually drew me in. And what we really hope by today is there are a lot of you from different areas of the college. Maybe you've never thought I've got any relationship, my research area, nothing to do with mental health. You've just heard now about climate change. I was actually going to mention about that, and pollution. But, you know, I would really say that mental health really underpins and can find its tentacles in every area of the college. So what this launch event has been really about highlighting this network to the people within Imperial College. Dasha mentioned at the beginning we have a range of different areas of faculties, but we are largely seen as a medical sort of faculty, I guess, or medical sort of network. That is absolutely not what we want to be. We want to reach out to the business school, the design school. We've got links already with those, but any of you in any other areas of college or friends or colleagues, you know, please do highlight this network. As has been mentioned earlier on, mental health, whilst it affects a huge number of people and it's increasing, our level of investment in clinical services and research has been woeful, I think, to put it mildly. But I would say in my lifetime, but also looking to the future now, the investment is going to be there. It is highlighted, particularly young adults, child and adolescents and young adult health. This is where a lot of focus and a lot of money, and one hates to be driven by the money, but this is, you know, bringing people in, we're able to apply for funds, we can start to develop the field. It is going to be a massive growth area. And really, since Dasha joined us, but also Martina joined us in the division of psychiatry, this has really brought our focus in that area. And it's an absolute pleasure, therefore, to have you know, them as part of the division and Dasha leading this network, because I think, you know, there is where a lot of the opportunities will lie. I have to say this is my first large event like this since early March 2020, and it is quite challenging, I think. However, one of the good things that the pandemic has shown us is collaborations. It has actually allowed access to people who may not be able to leave home for various reasons, or you know, the travel distances, conference, etc. I'm not saying it's ideal that we do it through screens, but what we have come together is the transdisciplinary collaborations to solve lots of issues around COVID. And I think what is absolutely key is that focus and that drive and success in many, many areas does spill over into other areas. We can do it. We have broken down a lot of the silos between our different professions, and that has got to be maintained. We cannot lose that benefit from the COVID pandemic. I think, you know, to me, collaboration is the ultimate thing, and that's what this network, we hope, will bring together. Of course, what we don't have, listening to Kathy, is pots of money sitting available, but we know that there are pots of money out there. Paul Matthews talked about the MRC. We know NIHR wants to invest in people who may not think of themselves in the medical area, but have the skills that we need to solve the problems. And so even if you're not thinking, well, I've got nothing to do with medical science or mental health, they are looking for biostatisticians, data scientists. So if you have those skills and you think you'd like to get involved, there are lots of opportunities, as I've already said. Because what you've heard today, you've gone from sort of mice, Bill Wisden and sleep circuits, exquisitely, very, very targeted circuitry through amazing sort of genetic manipulation, through to the AI. And obviously there's a whole host in between, and I'm kind of more nearer the mice than the AI, but I am now drifting, knowing how important it is, the data science and AI. So again, it's a broad church. There will be no space that you can't find a collaborator or a niche or something to develop. And that, I think, what is so exciting about mental health is because we have lots of animal or preclinical models that we can take through into translation. And a lot of that was exemplified by David Nutt's talk. So really, to wrap up, it's one, to thank all of you in the person, but I guess some of you are still listening online. I have to say it was really odd having to actually make sure my trousers were ironed today rather than sitting in a Zoom where it didn't really matter whether they were a bit crinkled or not. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's great to see so many people face to face again. The thanks I would like to give is obviously to Dasha, who steered this network together. Since she's joined Imperial, the network and the collaborations and links have been fantastic, have benefited psychiatry, and now I hope that everybody within Imperial can benefit across. The steering committee, Pip, Lindsay, Bala and Louise, and also critical support from Danielle, Lorna and Genevieve. We wouldn't be here without them. You heard the plea earlier on, if you want to get involved, please do, contact Dasha. As I said, it's a really broad church. One of the things I think will be coming out is you've heard about funding calls, and I think those will always focus the mind. We have a BRC bid, Biomedical Research Centre bid, going in a few weeks' time, and I've had 2 or 3 meetings today, all because partly this network, we know the links will be putting in cross-faculty, cross-silo bids, and that's what it's about. So please, I know Paula Kirby's here, so please think about bids. Is there a mental health angle? If there is, yes. Who's in the network doing it? How can you collaborate? How can we develop this into tangible differences in patient care, but also just the general public health, mental health, which is absolutely key. So I won't say anything more because I know there are now drinks and maybe a bit of fresh air out there, a bit of heat in London. The summer has not disappeared completely. It's probably better weather now than it would have been in July at the launch, actually, where we would have been so limited in the number of people would have been here, which is why it got moved. So I'd like to thank you all, thank all the steering group, but also thank you to Dasha for leading and put this together. So thank you.
everyone, and please, sorry that those of you who are online, please go and pour yourselves a glass of wine at home from your fridge. We have some here. If you want to, if you're online and you're in the vicinity, pop down. Thank you very much.